The military dog came through the emergency room doors like a warning no one was ready to hear. He was big, scarred across one flank, moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that didn't belong in a hospital hallway. Doctors stumbled backward. A nurse dropped a tray. Someone shouted for security. But the dog didn't snarl, didn't lunge. He moved through the chaos like he was looking for something specific, and when he found it, he stopped. He stopped in front of Emily Reeves, a white uniformed nurse standing near the supply cart, unremarkable to everyone in that building. The dog lowered his scarred head and pressed it gently against her knee. Not threatening, not random. A salute. If you've never heard a story like this before, stay right here. Subscribe to the channel before you keep watching, because this is the kind of story that will make you question everything you think you know about who deserves to be seen. Hit the like button and drop a comment with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The dog's name was Kodiak. That was the tag on his harness, faded black letters stamped into weathered nylon, the kind of equipment that had been through more than one deployment. He was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 8 years old, moving with a limp that he was clearly trying to hide but couldn't, not fully. His left rear leg carried less weight than it should have. Emily noticed that within 4 seconds of him walking through the door. She noticed a lot of things people assumed she didn't. That was the particular burden of being invisible. Harlow General sat at the edge of Caldwell, Nebraska. Not a big city, not a small town, just one of those places that existed in between things. The hospital had 4 floors, a trauma bay that handled everything from farm equipment accidents to cardiac events, and a staff hierarchy so rigid it might as well have been load-bearing. Emily had worked there for 3 years. She knew every hallway, every supply cabinet, every machine that beeped slightly wrong when a calibration was off. She knew which attending physicians preferred their morning updates and bullet points, and which ones wanted you to walk them through it, slowly, as if you'd never had an original thought in your life. She had been walking slowly for 3 years. It wasn't always a choice. At Harlow General, your role determined your ceiling, and Emily's role was clinical nurse 2, overnight and swing shifts preferred, the kind of scheduling that ensured you were perpetually tired and rarely present for the decisions that mattered. She had put in twice for the clinical leadership pathway. Both times, Dr. Marcus Holt had reviewed her application, and both times the response had come back the same: insufficient supervisory experience. Holt was the kind of physician who filled a room with himself before he even opened his mouth. Broad shoulders, silver at his temples, the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told he was asking the wrong question. He ran the ER the way generals ran supply lines, controlling information, rewarding loyalty, punishing deviation. Nurses who questioned him got the worst rotations. Those who deferred got mentioned in departmental memos. Emily had learned early that she was not going to be mentioned in any memo. She had learned to live with that. What she hadn't learned to do was ignore a dog in visible pain. The man who came in with Kodiak was leaning on the doorframe when Emily first saw him. Mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, in the way of someone who had once been built for physical work and hadn't entirely lost it. He had a veteran's posture, spine straight even when the rest of him was clearly exhausted, the kind of bearing that didn't come from a gym. There was a bandage on his left forearm, fresh gauze, probably changed that morning. His name tag, attached to what looked like a medical intake bracelet still on his wrist, read Dale Morrow. He wasn't looking at the intake desk. He was looking at his dog. Kodiak had stopped moving. He stood in the center of the ER waiting area, head slightly lowered, and then, inexplicably, impossible to explain, he turned away from the front desk and walked directly toward Emily. Not toward the closest person. Not toward the loudest voice. Toward her specifically, threading between a wheeled cart and a row of chairs with the focused calm of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. He pressed his head against her knee. Emily's hand moved before she thought about it, dropping to the back of his neck, fingers reading the tension there the way you'd check a pulse. Tight, too tight. He was compensating through his upper body because his hindquarter was doing something it shouldn't. Sorry about that. Dale Morrow had pushed off the doorframe and was crossing toward her, slower than he probably wanted to be. He doesn't usually... He's not supposed to be in here, I know. I'll get him. Don't. Emily kept her voice low. He's not causing any trouble. He came in with you? Yeah. Dale stopped a few feet away, looking at his dog with something complicated in his face. I'm here for a follow-up. Had a procedure 3 days ago, blood pressure's been off. They said come in if it stayed elevated. I didn't want to leave him in the truck. What procedure? He blinked. I'm sorry? 3 days ago. What kind of procedure? Abdominal. He paused. Why? Emily looked at the bracelet on his wrist. Outpatient surgical. She looked at the slight pallor around his mouth, the way he'd been holding his right side without seeming to realize it. She looked at the rate of his breathing, not labored, but faster than it needed to be for a man standing still. She said carefully, Have you had any calf pain, swelling in the legs? Dale frowned. My right calf's been sore. I figured it was from sitting in the truck. When did that start? 2 days ago, maybe. Okay. She stood up. I need you to sit down for me. Right here. She gestured to the nearest chair. I'm going to get someone to check you in immediately. It's not Mr. Morrow. She kept her voice even. Please sit down. He sat. Kodiak sat beside him without being told. Emily walked to the nurse's station and found Renata Ose pulling a chart. Renata was 3 years into the ER, sharp, and one of the few people at Harlow General who actually listened when Emily talked. New patient just came in, 50-something male, 3 days post-abdominal surgery, presenting with unilateral calf pain and elevated resting respiratory rate. I want a DVT workup. Is he in triage? Not yet. I'm asking you to flag him now before he sits in the waiting room for 40 minutes. Renata looked past her toward Dale Morrow, then back at Emily. You do a full assessment? Enough of one. Renata, calf pain, post-op, SOB. I hear you. Renata was already moving. What happened next was the part Emily could have predicted. Dr. Marcus Holt came out of the trauma bay at the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how you thought about it. He saw Emily at the nurse's station, saw Renata moving toward a patient, and crossed the floor with the kind of stride that meant a correction was coming. Reeves. He didn't slow down. What's the situation? New patient, possible DVT. I asked Renata to flag him for immediate workup. Holt glanced at Dale, glanced at the dog, glanced back at Emily with an expression she'd seen before. Not anger, exactly. More like mild disappointment, the way a teacher looks at a student who keeps answering questions out of turn. Did you do an intake assessment? Informal. He just walked in. Informal. He said the word like he was setting it down somewhere. So you performed an unsanctioned clinical assessment in the waiting room. I noticed his presentation. Your job, Holt said, not raising his voice, is to monitor patients in the care pathway, not to triage in the lobby. We have a process. I know we have a process. The process would have put him in a chair for 40 minutes, because we have 12 other patients ahead of him. He turned toward Renata. Standard intake. Whatever order he arrived. Renata looked at Emily. Emily looked at Holt. There was a version of this conversation where she escalated, where she pushed, where she said the things she was actually thinking. She'd had that version before. It had cost her a rotation, 3 weeks on nights with no weekend relief, and a meeting with the nursing supervisor that was technically described as a check-in, but felt nothing like one. She stepped back. She said, Understood. And she went back to her station and charted the interaction, time-stamped, because that was the one thing she'd learned to do without anyone telling her to. The next hour passed the way most of them did. 2 chest pains, 1 laceration, a pediatric fever that resolved without intervention. Emily moved through her patients with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to do the work without the recognition, without the confirmation, without anyone telling her she was right. She knew she was right. She'd been right for 20 years in places that made this ER look like a practice round. Nobody at Harlow General knew that. She'd kept it that way. There was a reason she'd stopped talking about her background, and the reason was simpler and more painful than anyone might have guessed. She'd learned that when you told people where you'd been, what you'd done, they either didn't believe you or they expected you to be something you no longer were. The version of herself that had operated in combat zones, that had intubated patients in the back of moving vehicles, that had trained alongside handlers and their dogs in conditions that would have ended most careers. That version was in the past. She'd put her hand in and pulled back a fistful of ash, and she'd decided quietly, over one very long winter in Caldwell, that she was going to be ordinary for a while. Being ordinary turned out to have a cost she hadn't fully calculated. She was stalking a crash cart near Bay 3 when Kodiak barked. Not the bark of a dog who wanted something, not territorial, not playful. A sharp, urgent, single bark, followed immediately by a second one. Emily was moving before the sound finished echoing. Dale Morrow was in the chair where she'd left him. Except he wasn't sitting normally anymore. He was leaning forward, right hand gripping his left arm, face the color of old concrete. Kodiak was standing rigid in front of him, nose pointed at his handler's chest, tail rigid. Emily dropped to a knee in front of him. "Mr. Morrow, talk to me." Something's... His voice came out wrong, labored, like he was talking through resistance. "I can't..." Chest? She already had 2 fingers at his wrist. Pulse rapid and irregular, not the clean arrhythmia of anxiety, but something with more texture, something with gaps. She looked at his neck. Jugular vein distension, faint but present. "I need a gurney and a crash kit in the lobby right now," she said loudly, not shouting but projecting, the way she'd learned to project across helicopter noise and open air. "And I need an EKG ordered, right now." Renata was already moving. Holt came out of Bay 2 with his mouth already open. "Reeves, massive PE, possible." She was already repositioning Dale, hands moving on their own instinct. 3 days post-op, calf pain, now presenting with chest pain and JVD, pulse is irregular. "You don't have..." "Dr. Holt." She turned and looked at him with an expression she hadn't used in 3 years. Not defiance. Something quieter than that, and considerably more dangerous. "You can talk to me about protocol in 20 minutes. Right now I need you to either order the EKG yourself or step back and let me handle it." The lobby went still. It was maybe 3 seconds, felt longer. Holt moved toward the patient. Whether it was her words or his own clinical instincts finally processing what he was seeing, he moved, and that was what mattered. I took one look at Dale Morrow and his voice changed entirely. The administrative tone gone, replaced with the clipped language of someone who'd done this long enough to recognize a deteriorating patient. "Get me that gurney. Call respiratory. Get imaging on standby." Dale was transferred to a bay within 90 seconds. Kodiak tried to follow and was gently redirected by a tech named Priya, who looked at the dog with barely contained terror and then at Emily with an expression that clearly said what is happening. Emily knelt next to Kodiak and put her hand on his neck again. "He's being taken care of," she said quietly. "Sit." He sat. She didn't ask herself how she'd known that would work. Some things were stored in the body and not in the brain. The next 45 minutes were controlled chaos. Dale Morrow had a pulmonary embolism. Not a massive one, not immediately fatal, but the CT showed the clot clearly, and the cascade would have finished him in another 30 or 40 minutes without intervention. Holt ran the bay competently. Emily was not invited into the room. She knew she wouldn't be. She stood at the edge of the corridor and listened to the monitors and tracked the numbers through the window and did not say anything to anyone. When Dale was stabilized, she went back to the lobby. She sat down 2 chairs away from where Kodiak was lying, his leash tied to the chair leg, his enormous head resting on his front paws, his eyes tracking the door where his handler had disappeared. "He's stable," Emily said quietly. "He's going to be okay." Kodiak's eyes moved to her face. They stayed there. She leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and looked back at him, and for a moment, just a moment, the hospital around her fell away. She thought about a different building, years ago. The particular smell of a triage tent in August. A dog named Ruckus, who used to sleep next to her cot and growl at anything that moved after midnight. She thought about what it meant to do this kind of work without permission, without recognition, in conditions that demanded everything you had and gave nothing back. She pulled herself back. This was the present. Caldwell, Nebraska. Harlow General. Bay 2 was already filling with another patient. She stood up. She had 3 more hours on her shift and she was going to finish them. She was walking back toward the nurses' station when she heard footsteps behind her. Not running, purposeful, and turned to find Holt following her. His expression had shifted again. Not the administrative look. Not the clinical look. Something she hadn't seen on his face before, which was a look that could almost be described as unsettled. "The PE," he said. "You caught that." "I did." "Before he was even triaged?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not the comfortable silence of a man who had already decided what to say, but something more effortful. How did you know? Emily looked at him steadily. Because I looked at him. Holt seemed to want to say something else. Instead, he said, "The animal needs to be removed from the waiting area." Of course. She turned and kept walking. Behind her, she heard him stop. She didn't turn around. It was another 2 hours before she encountered Dale Morrow again. He was in a monitored bed in the general ward, an IV running, color returning to his face in gradual increments. Someone had thought to ask about Kodiak, and the dog had been brought to the exterior corridor outside his window. Not technically inside, not technically a problem. Emily had had nothing to do with the arrangement and had no way to prove she'd mentioned the option quietly to Priya, who had mentioned it to the ward supervisor, who had decided it was worth bending the policy on. She was doing a medication pass when Dale caught her eye through the door. "Hey." His voice was rough, recovering. Can you come in for a minute?" She checked her watch. She had 3 patients left. She went in anyway. He looked at her the way people sometimes did after a near miss, with the slightly unsteady eyes of someone reassessing what they thought they understood about the day. "They told me what you did," he said, "out in the lobby. I noticed your presentation. The team did the rest. They said you called it before anyone had run a test. I had a reasonable suspicion based on your history and symptoms." Dale Morrow was quiet for a moment, studying her. There was something careful in his expression, something deliberate, the way a person looks when they're deciding whether to say the thing they're actually thinking. "You served," he said. It wasn't a question. Emily kept her face neutral. "I'm a nurse." "Yeah, you're a nurse." He didn't look away. "I've been around a lot of nurses. They don't move like you move. They don't talk like you talk. The way you came in when Kodiak barked, that wasn't someone who learned emergency response in a classroom." She was quiet. "I did a second tour with the 75th, he said. Ranger Battalion. We had a medic, staff sergeant, worked with the K9 units. Same look you've got. Same way of walking into a room like you're already calculating the exits." Emily looked at the monitors. His pulse was steadying. His pressure was coming down. "You should rest," she said. "I'm not wrong. Mr. Morrow. Dale. Dale." She exhaled. "Get some sleep. I'll check on Kodiak before my shift ends." She left before he could say anything else. But she stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed, longer than she needed to, long enough for a passing orderly to look at her and look away. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Maybe nothing. Maybe she was just standing still for a minute because she so rarely got to. The confrontation with Holt came the next morning. She knew it was coming. She'd known it the second she'd said what she said in the lobby. Those 3 seconds of silence had been too expensive. She'd known she'd pay for them. Holt called her into the administrative corridor outside the nursing supervisor's office at 7:40 a.m., before the shift change was fully settled. He had the nursing director, Patricia Summer, with him. Summer was a careful woman, not unkind, but careful in the way of someone who had learned that keeping her head down was how you kept your job. She gave Emily a look that was almost apologetic and then focused on her tablet. "Yesterday afternoon," Holt began, "you performed an unsanctioned assessment of a patient in the public waiting area, issued directives to nursing staff without physician order, and made clinical declarations in a public corridor that created confusion among my team. I identified a patient in acute deterioration. You made a call that wasn't yours to make. He would have deteriorated in the waiting room. That is not the point." Holt's voice was measured, controlled. He'd had this kind of conversation before many times, and he knew how to have it without raising his voice and without blinking. "The point is that you bypassed the clinical hierarchy. You issued instructions to Renata Osei without authorization. And then, in front of staff and patients, you told me to either order treatment or step back. I did." He paused. "You're confirming that?" "Yes." Summer shifted slightly but didn't speak. "You're a clinical nurse too, Holt said. "You have a role, you do excellent work within that role. But what you did yesterday was outside it, and what you said to me in that corridor was—" "Did he survive?" Emily asked. The question landed between them like something dropped from a height. "Excuse me?" "Dale Morrow, did he survive?" Holt was quiet for a moment. "He's stable. That's not—" "I'm asking because the reason I said what I said in that corridor is that the alternative was watching him deteriorate while we had a procedural conversation. She kept her voice steady, not combative, not flat, something in between, the tone she had learned for situations where you needed to be heard without triggering someone's defenses. I understand the hierarchy. I respect the hierarchy. What happened yesterday was not a challenge to your authority. It was a response to a patient in front of me who was about to die. Holt looked at her for a long time. You're being placed on administrative review, he said. Effective immediately. You'll finish this shift, then you're on desk assignment pending the outcome. Emily looked at him. She looked at Summer, who was looking at her tablet. She looked back at Holt. Okay, she said. She turned and walked back toward the floor. She had 3 hours left of her shift, and she was going to spend them doing exactly what she always did. She didn't know, couldn't have known, standing in that corridor at 7:40 in the morning, that by 10:15 a.m., 2 black SUVs with federal plates would pull into the Harlow General parking structure, and the 4 people who got out of them would not be there to see a patient. They would be there for her. She found out the way she found out most things at Harlow General, not because anyone told her, but because she was paying attention. Priya came through the east corridor at 10:08 a.m., moving faster than her usual pace, glanced at Emily, glanced away, and then said something to Renata that made Renata's head come up sharply and swivel toward the front entrance. Emily tracked the angle of Renata's eyes and followed it to the lobby windows, and through the glass she could see the parking structure across the street, and in the parking structure she could see 2 black SUVs parked side by side on the ground level, both of them with the low-profile federal plates that didn't announce themselves but didn't exactly hide either. She kept moving. She had a medication cart to finish and 2 dressing changes that were already overdue, and whatever was in those vehicles was not her concern, except that 15 minutes later, when she was in room 114 changing the wound dressing on a 60-year-old man named Gerald Fitch, who kept trying to show her photos of his granddaughter on his phone, she heard voices in the hallway. Not the ambient noise of a working hospital floor, but something different, lower, the controlled register of people being careful about what they said and where. She finished the dressing. She thanked Gerald Fitch. She stepped into the hallway. There were 4 of them, 2 men, 2 women, all in civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes fit when you bought them to look like civilian clothes. The IDs on their lanyards were turned face in. One of the men was speaking quietly to Patricia Summer, who had the expression of someone trying to look unconcerned and not quite managing it. Summer was nodding more than the conversation seemed to require. Emily pushed her cart toward the supply room. She was 10 feet away when she heard Summer say her name. Not loudly, almost under her breath. But the hallway acoustics at Harlow General were terrible, something to do with the flooring and the low ceiling tiles. And Emily had spent 3 years learning to read the specific frequency of her name being said in rooms where she wasn't supposed to be listening. She didn't stop. She turned the corner, parked the cart against the wall, and waited. Footsteps. The measured kind. Ms. Reeves. She turned around. The woman who'd spoken was somewhere in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back without any particular effort, the kind of posture that came from years of being in rooms where posture mattered. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't trying to be intimidating either, which Emily found more unnerving than if she had been. I'm Special Agent Diane Kowalski, the woman said. I'm with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I'd like a few minutes of your time. Behind her, the second woman and both men had fanned out in a way that wasn't aggressive but wasn't casual either. Summer was hovering at the edge of the hallway with her tablet pressed to her chest. Emily looked at Kowalski. I'm in the middle of a shift, Emily said. I know, I apologize for the timing. Kowalski didn't sound particularly apologetic, but she didn't sound like she was pretending either. This will be brief. We can use an empty consult room if you'd like. What is this regarding? Kowalski glanced once, very briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward the ward where Dale Morrow's room was. Emily said, Give me 5 minutes. She flagged Renata, handed off 2 patients, and told nobody else anything. She walked to the family consult room on the 2nd floor with Kowalski and one of the men, the taller one, who had not introduced himself and continued not to, and she sat down across from them at the round table and put her hands flat on the surface and waited. Kowalski opened a folder. Inside was a photograph. She slid it across the table. It was Emily. Not recent. Maybe 7 years ago, maybe 8. The photo was taken outdoors, high contrast, the kind of image that came from a long lens rather than a posed shot. She She was in uniform. She was crouching next to a dog, and the dog was large and brown and had his head tilted toward her. And in the photograph, her expression was the same one she wore when she was doing the work she was actually built for. Focused, completely present, not performing anything for anyone. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she looked at Kowalski. Where did you get this? It's from an archived operational file. Kowalski folded her hands. Dr. Reeves. The title landed on the table between them. Emily didn't flinch, but something in her chest moved. My name is Emily Reeves. I'm a nurse. You're a nurse, Kowalski agreed. You're also a former U.S. Army Medical Corps officer, rank of major, medical specialty in emergency trauma and veterinary-adjacent canine care protocols. You separated from service 6 years ago. She paused. Under contested circumstances. The room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor was beeping. I'd like to know, Emily said carefully, why the DCIS is in Caldwell, Nebraska, talking to a clinical nurse too about a military file. Kowalski looked at her for a moment. Then she said, because Kodiak's hip isn't the only injury that matches the pattern. Emily went very still. There are 11 other dogs, Kowalski said. Same contractor, same implant series, same cover documentation. 11 dogs discharged from active canine service in the last 4 years, with injuries recorded as combat-related that were not combat-related. She slid a second page across the table. It was a list of names, dog names, handler names, unit designations. 3 of them were euthanized within 8 months of separation. The cause of death listed in each case was degenerative joint disease, advanced stage, incompatible with quality of life. Emily looked at the list. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The contractor, she said finally. Halloran Defense Solutions. They held the K-9 medical supply contract for the Central Command Theater from 2017 through 2022. Kowalski's voice was flat, professional. The voice of someone who had learned to deliver this kind of information without letting it change their face. They were responsible for sourcing and supplying surgical-grade implants for working dogs injured in theater. Orthopedic hardware, primarily. And the hardware was defective. The hardware was counterfeit. Civilian-grade orthopedic components relabeled as military spec, at roughly 40 cents on the dollar. Kowalski let that sit. The dogs that received them degraded faster than expected. Some of them were pulled from duty and retired, where the deterioration continued. Some were euthanized. Emily looked at the list again. She recognized 2 of the unit designations. Why are you here? She said, and her voice was even, very even, the way it got when she was working to keep it that way. There's a federal investigation. The DCIS exists. Why do you need a nurse in Nebraska? Because you tried to report this, Kowalski said. In 2019, you filed a medical irregularity report through your chain of command, alleging that post-operative outcomes in theater K-9 units were inconsistent with the documented hardware specifications. You submitted supporting documentation, implant serial numbers, surgical outcome records, a statistical analysis you put together yourself using data from 7 dogs you'd personally treated or reviewed. Emily said nothing. The report was closed, Kowalski continued. Classified as an internal audit concern, referred to the Surgeon General's office, and filed. The officer who closed it was Colonel Terrence Wade. He retired 14 months later with a full pension and a consulting contract with Halloran Defense Solutions. The room felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. Your discharge, the tall man said, first words he'd spoken, and he said them like he'd been holding them for a while. Contested separation, that's in the file too. Conduct unbecoming, insubordination, repeated attempts to circumvent chain of command. Yes, Emily said. You appealed. 3 times. Appeal was denied each time. Yes. He looked at her steadily. You gave up a career in military medicine with 18 years of service because you wouldn't let a fraud report die. Emily looked back at him. I gave up a career because someone with more rank than me decided the report was inconvenient. I didn't decide anything. Silence. Kowalski said, We'd like to know if you still have the documentation. The question was quiet, but it filled the room entirely. Emily thought about a thumb drive she'd kept in 3 different places over 6 years. She thought about encrypted backups on 2 separate servers she still paid the annual maintenance fee on, every January, without letting herself think too hard about why she kept doing it. She thought about a manila envelope in the false bottom of a storage box in her apartment closet that contained printed copies of records she hadn't looked at in 2 years but hadn't been able to throw away. "I need to know what you're building," she said. "We're building a federal case. Against Halloran. Against Halloran and against the network of officials who enabled and profited from the contract fraud. This is not a single bad actor. This is a procurement chain with deliberate cover mechanisms at multiple levels." Kowalski leaned forward slightly. "What you filed in 2019, if the supporting documentation still exists and is intact, is the earliest documented evidence of the fraud. Everything we've built in the last 8 months points back to the pattern you identified first." Emily sat with that. Outside the window, a Nebraska November was doing its usual gray work on the sky. She could see the parking structure from here, and both SUVs were still there. "Kodiak's injury," she said. "That's what brought you here." Dale Morrow filed a veteran's complaint 6 weeks ago when his dog was denied VA coverage for the hip surgery. The denial cited the injury as pre-existing and combat-related. Kowalski's mouth tightened slightly. "Kodiak's surgical records from theater show a hardware implant placed in 2021. When we pulled the serial number, it matched the counterfeit series." "He's been in pain for 3 years," Emily said. Not a question. "The joint degraded. By the time Morrow noticed the limp, the original implant had fractured internally." Kowalski paused. "Mr. Morrow didn't come to Harlow specifically. He came because it was the nearest hospital when his own health situation forced the issue. The fact that you were here—" She stopped. "Coincidence," Emily said. "Or something else," Kowalski said without elaborating. Emily stood up. "I have patience." "Ms. Reeves, Dr. Reeves," Emily said. It was the first time she'd used the title herself, and it came out quieter than she intended. "I'll contact you by end of day. Give me a number." Kowalski slid a card across the table. Emily picked it up and walked back to the floor. She spent the next 4 hours doing her job. She did it well. She did it the way she always did it, with the same precision and the same attention and the same slightly too comprehensive documentation that Holt had once described in a performance review as thorough but occasionally excessive. She checked on Dale Morrow twice. Both times he was awake. The first time she checked his IV and adjusted his pillow and didn't say anything beyond the clinical. The second time she stopped in the doorway and looked at him across the room, and he looked back, and she said, "The people in the black SUVs." He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "They called me 3 weeks ago," he said. "I told them you were here. I didn't know if you'd want me to, but—" He stopped. "I figured if anybody deserved to be part of whatever's happening, it was you." Emily pressed her lips together. She wasn't sure what she felt about that. Gratitude and something more complicated, the particular discomfort of being found by a past you'd carefully set aside. "How long has Kodiak been limping?" she asked. Dale looked at the window, at the exterior corridor where his dog was lying on a blanket someone had brought out, enormous head on his paws, watching. 8 months. Maybe 10. I kept telling myself it was age. He's 8. I told myself—" His voice roughened. He stopped and started again. "I kept thinking he'd been through enough. I didn't want to be the guy who put him through more." "He needs surgery," Emily said. "The implant has to come out. There's a veterinary surgical team at the University Hospital in Lincoln that does orthopedic work. I can write the referral." "They'll cover it?" "I'll make sure they cover it." She didn't know exactly how she was going to do that. She had been placed on administrative review and had desk assignment pending. She was not, technically, supposed to be making any calls that weren't directly patient-facing. She made the call anyway, on her lunch break, standing in the stairwell between the second and third floors, and spoke to a veterinary surgical resident named Marcus, who knew exactly what a fractured internal orthopedic implant looked like, and said he could get Kodiak in by the end of the week. She went back to the floor. At 4:30 p.m., Holt stopped her in the corridor near the nurses' station. His face was different than it had been that morning. The morning face had been composed, institutional, the face of a man executing a decision he'd already made. This face was something else, something that might have been uncertainty if she'd ever seen it on him before. "The federal agents," he said. "Yes." "They asked about you." "I know." He looked at her. "They asked about your credentials, your background." He paused. Patricia showed them your personnel file. Emily waited. There was a discrepancy, he said, and he said the word carefully, like he was still figuring out what it meant. Your nursing licensure is current. Your undergraduate record is complete. But there's a gap in your employment history, 5 years prior to your nursing degree. That's correct? The agents seemed to find that gap relevant. Did they? Holt was quiet for a moment. The nurse's station behind him was busy, 2 nurses charting, a tech on the phone, the ordinary noise of the floor filling the space around them. They didn't tell me anything, he said. I want you to know I didn't ask. Whatever it is, he stopped, started differently. You caught the PE yesterday. You were right. I know, Emily said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him working through something, the particular effort of a man who had organized his world around a set of assumptions and was quietly discovering that some of them were wrong. She didn't help him with it. It wasn't her job to make that easier. The administrative review, he said finally. Yes. I'd like to discuss its status. I have to finish my shift, Emily said, and walked past him. She stayed until 7 p.m., 2 hours past her scheduled end, because there was a pediatric case in Bay 4 that needed continuity, and she wasn't going to hand it to someone who didn't know the child's baseline. When she finally walked out through the staff exit, the night was cold, and the parking lot was half empty, and both black SUVs were gone. She sat in her car for a minute, then she pulled out Kowalski's card. She didn't call. She sent a text. I have the documentation. All of it. Call me tomorrow. She put the phone in the cup holder and drove home. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Delaney Street that had been built in the 1970s and renovated once, unenthusiastically, in the early 2000s. It was small and clean, and she'd lived there for 2.5 years without hanging anything on the walls, which she'd told herself was because she hadn't gotten around to it, and which she suspected was for a different reason entirely. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table. She opened her laptop. She opened the encrypted backup she paid for every January, and she sat with the files for the first time in 2 years, and she read through them the way you read something you wrote when you were a different person, recognizing the logic, recognizing the methodology, feeling the distance between who had written this and who was sitting in this kitchen now. The statistical analysis was still solid. The serial number cross-references were still intact. The surgical outcome records she'd pulled and copied before her access was revoked were all there, time-stamped, signed. She'd been right. She'd been right in 2019, and she'd been right in every subsequent year, and it hadn't mattered because being right doesn't matter if the person above you decides the truth is inconvenient. She closed the laptop and went to the closet and found the storage box and pulled the manila envelope out of the false bottom and put it on the table without opening it. She already knew what was in it. She went to sleep. At 2:17 a.m., her phone woke her. Not a call. A text from an unknown number. Back off the K9 case. You don't know who you're dealing with. She stared at it for a moment. Then she put the phone face down on the nightstand, lay back down, and looked at the ceiling. She hadn't told anyone she'd agreed to cooperate. She hadn't told anyone she had the documentation. The only people who knew she'd spoken to Kowalski were the 4 agents, Patricia Summer and Dale Morrow. And yet, she reached for her phone again and photographed the text with her second phone, an old one she kept in her nightstand, charged but inactive, because she'd learned some habits too deeply to drop them, and sent the image to Kowalski's number with a 1-line message. This came in 2 hours after our conversation. You may have a leak. Then she lay back down. She didn't sleep again. She was back at Harlow General by 6:45 a.m., technically on desk assignment, but unwilling to sit at a desk while there were patients on the floor who needed work done. Summer hadn't formally restricted her to administrative duties yet. The paperwork was pending, which meant Emily was operating in the particular gray zone of someone who hadn't yet been told she couldn't do something. She was in the break room at 7:20 a.m. when Renata came in and closed the door and looked at her with an expression that Emily hadn't seen on Renata's face before. Someone was in the records room last night, Renata said. Emily set her coffee down. After hours. The overnight clerk heard something and checked. File cabinets were open, the physical filing section, the pre-digitization records from the early 2000s. Nothing obvious was taken, but the organization was wrong. Someone had gone through them. Which section? Emily asked. Renata hesitated. Veteran patient files, specifically the military intake section. She looked at Emily steadily. They had to have known where to look. Emily thought up about the text at 2:17 a.m. She thought about how many people knew that Kodiak's chart had been pulled the previous morning, that his serial number had been flagged, that federal agents had visited the hospital and spoken specifically to her. She thought about the fact that someone had been in this building, at night, looking for something. Don't tell anyone else yet, Emily said. Emily, give me an hour. Renata looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and left. Emily pulled out her phone. She dialed Kowalski. Kowalski answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. Your records room was accessed last night, Emily said. A pause. Which records? Veteran patient files. Pre-digital section. Military intake. Another pause, longer. Then Kowalski said something to someone in the room with her. Emily couldn't make out the words, and came back to the line. Don't move anything. Don't tell anyone what you're doing. We're 40 minutes out. There's something else, Emily said. The text. You got it. We got it. We're tracing it. Kowalski's voice was clipped now, the unhurried quality of the previous day entirely gone. Dr. Reeves, the documentation you mentioned, I need to know it's somewhere safe. Emily looked at her locker across the break room. She'd brought the manila envelope. She hadn't been able to leave it in her apartment, not after 2:17 a.m., not with the knowledge that someone had already decided she was a problem. It's safe, she said. I need it today. I know. She paused. There's something else you should know. When I treated Kodiak yesterday, I found a secondary injury, the hip I expected, but also a compression pattern along the iliac crest that wasn't consistent with a single trauma event. She kept her voice clinical, precise. It looks like it happened in stages. Progressive. Which means if someone with proper imaging access had looked at this dog at any point in the last 18 months, they would have seen what was happening and could have intervened. Kowalski was quiet. He was cleared for separation, Emily said. Someone reviewed his file and cleared him. Yes. That person either missed it or didn't look. Or, Kowalski said, they looked and they knew what they were seeing and they signed off anyway. The break room was cold. Emily realized she hadn't touched her coffee. 40 minutes, Kowalski said, and ended the call. Emily sat for a moment, then she stood up, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and went to find Patricia Summer. She found her in the administrative wing, already at her desk, already looking like a woman who had been having a morning she hadn't asked for. When Emily appeared in the doorway, Summer looked up with an expression that combined anxiety and something approaching relief, which Emily took to mean that Summer had already heard about the records room. The federal agents are coming back, Emily said, within the hour. They'll need access to the records room and to all physical files related to the military patient intake section. Summer nodded, her tablet gripped in both hands. Is this about the patient who was admitted yesterday? Morrow? It's bigger than one patient. How much bigger? Emily thought about Kowalski's list. 11 dogs. 3 of them euthanized. A contractor with a federal supply chain and a network of officials who'd made sure a medical irregularity report filed by a major with 18 years of service had been quietly buried. Significantly, Emily said. Summer absorbed this. She was processing the way a person processes when they realize they're standing closer to something large and serious than they thought they were. Emily, she said, and her voice had shifted. Less administrative, more direct, the voice of the person underneath the position. Are you all right? Emily looked at her. Someone texted me at 2 a.m. telling me to back off. Summer's face went pale. So, Emily said, I think things are about to become somewhat more complicated than an administrative review. She paused. I'd like my clinical duties restored while the federal investigation is active. I'm going to need to move freely through the hospital. Summer opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her tablet, looked back at Emily. The review, she started. Patricia. Emily kept her voice even. Marcus Holt put me on administrative review because I stepped outside my lane to save a patient's life. That patient is currently stable in Ward 2. The federal agents who are 25 minutes from this building came here specifically because of work I did 7 years ago that someone tried to erase. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. I don't think this is the right moment for desk assignment. Summer was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then she said, I'll tell Marcus. Emily walked back to the floor. At 8:04 a.m., Holt found her in the supply room and looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had spent the last 16 hours recalibrating something he'd thought was settled. Patricia called me, he said. Yes. She said the review is suspended pending the investigation. Yes. He crossed his arms. Not defensively, more like he was holding himself together while he worked through something. Who are you? He said, and he didn't mean it the way it might have sounded. He meant it the actual way, the direct way. Emily looked at him. I'm a nurse, she said, who used to be something else. Before he could respond, the radio at the nurse's station crackled, and Renata's voice came through with the particular tone that meant something was happening that wasn't in anyone's plan. We need someone in Ward 2 immediately. Morrow's monitors just went off. Not cardiac, something external. His door was found open, and Kodiak is gone from the corridor. Emily was already moving. She got to Dale Morrow's room in under a minute and found him sitting up in bed with his IV half pulled and his face tight with something between pain and fury. The exterior corridor window was open, the one that had been closed when she'd last checked, and the blanket Kodiak had been sleeping on was folded wrong, too quickly, the way something gets folded when someone moves in a hurry. He didn't run, Dale said, the second Emily came through the door. His voice was sharp, certain. Kodiak doesn't run. Someone moved him. Emily went to the window and looked out. The exterior corridor was empty. The morning was still and gray, and there was a door at the far end of the corridor that opened to the service alley, and that door was standing open, and from this angle, through the cold Nebraska morning, Emily could just make out the shape of a white van pulling away from the far end of the alley at a speed that was careful enough not to draw attention and fast enough to mean something. She memorized the van's rear end before it turned the corner. White, no markings, Nebraska plates, partial red, on the last 3 characters before the alley swallowed it. She pulled out her phone and called Kowalski before she was fully back inside the room. Someone just took Kodiak, she said. White van, no markings, Nebraska plates, partial NEB4 something, south exit off the service alley behind Harlow General, maybe 4 minutes ago. She heard Kowalski say something sharp to someone in the vehicle. Then, we're 12 minutes out. Did anyone see the driver? No visual. The exterior corridor door was open from the inside. This wasn't someone who broke in. Someone already in the building let them in or left that door open for them. A pause. Where's Morrow? His room. He's stable, but his IV line is partially dislodged. He tried to get up. Keep him there. Kowalski's voice had the tight compression of someone running contingencies in real time. Lock down that corridor. Don't touch the door. Emily ended the call and turned to find Dale already swinging his legs off the bed, his face the color of someone who was not going to be talked out of what he was about to do. Dale! She crossed the room and put her hand on his arm. Not gentle, not aggressive, the firm middle register that said she was serious. You have a pulmonary embolism. You are on anticoagulants. If you pull that line and stand up too fast, you will be on the floor in 30 seconds. He's my dog, Dale said, and his voice was rough and low and completely uninterested in being reasonable. I know. She kept her hand where it was. Federal agents are 12 minutes away. They're running the plates right now. Sitting down is the fastest way to get Kodiak back. He looked at her. His jaw was working. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had spent years in situations where action was survival and stillness was failure, and everything in him was screaming against the instruction she was giving him. 12 minutes, she said again. He sat back. She reseated the IV line, checked the insertion site, still clean, no infiltration, and taped it down properly. Her hands were steady. She was aware that her hands were steady in the particular way you become aware of something only when part of you is surprised by it. The door at the end of the corridor, Dale said. It has a keypad. I saw it when they brought me out for a walk yesterday. Staff access only, Emily said. 4-digit code rotated monthly. So whoever opened it either had the code or had a key card. Yes. Which means it's someone who works here. Emily didn't answer, but she didn't look away, and that was answer enough. She left Renata at Dale's door with instructions to call her immediately if anything changed, and walked fast to the administrative wing, where she found Patricia Summer already in conversation with the hospital's head of security, a retired city cop named Garrett Foss, who wore his ID badge on a retractable clip and had the permanently unhurried manner of someone who had decided, at some point in the last decade, that urgency was mostly theater. I was not having that morning. I need the keycard access log for the exterior corridor door on Ward 2, Emily said, without preamble. Foss looked at her. That's a security matter. The federal agents who are currently 9 minutes from this building are going to ask you the same question the moment they walk in. You can pull it now for me or pull it in 10 minutes for them. The dog that was taken is evidence in a federal fraud investigation. She kept her voice level. Your choice on timing. Foss looked at Summer. Summer nodded. He pulled out his radio and made the call. Emily walked back toward Ward 2. She stopped at the records room, which was now sealed with a strip of yellow security tape that Foss had placed at some point in the last hour. She hadn't asked him to do that, but was glad someone had thought of it. She stood at the door and looked through the small window at the filing cabinets. From here she could see that 2 of the drawers were not fully closed. Whoever had gone through them last night had been in a hurry, looking for the same thing Kowalski was looking for. The documentation Emily had already removed from this building. She thought about the manila envelope in her locker. She thought about the thumb drive in the inside pocket of her jacket, the one she'd transferred the encrypted backups to at 5 a.m., sitting at her kitchen table in the dark with her tea going cold. She thought about the fact that someone had come into this hospital and opened a filing cabinet and texted her at 2:17 a.m., all within the same 12-hour window, which meant they were moving fast, which meant they were either panicking or they decided that the window for containment was closing and they were willing to escalate to close it. Neither possibility was reassuring. Kowalski arrived at 8:19 a.m. with all 4 agents and a 5th person. Emily hadn't seen before. A man in his 30s, close-cropped hair, the particular flat-eyed economy of movement that meant federal law enforcement of a different flavor. He was introduced briefly as Agent Decker, and his ID said FBI, which meant the case had grown since yesterday. They set up in the conference room on the 2nd floor. Emily sat at the table and put the manila envelope in front of her and the thumb drive next to it. Kowalski looked at both items and then looked at Emily with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. You brought it, she said. You said you needed it today. Decker reached for the envelope. Emily put her hand on it, not blocking him, just pausing the moment. I wanted on record that this was collected willingly and that chain of custody starts here, in this room, with me handing it to a named federal agent. Decker looked at her. I've had evidence disappear before, Emily said. I'm not doing that again. Understood, Kowalski said. She pulled a form from her folder, dated it, signed it, slid it across to Emily. Sign there. Chain of custody starts the moment your pen leaves the paper. Emily signed. She pushed the envelope and the thumb drive across the table. Kowalski picked up the thumb drive and handed it to the agent on her left without looking away from Emily. Walk me through the statistical analysis you mentioned, the one from 2019. I cross-referenced post-operative outcome data for 31 K9 units treated in theater between 2017 and 2019, specifically recovery timelines, range of motion assessment at 60 and 90 days post-op, and return to duty rates. Emily had spent 7 years not talking about this, and found that the words came out of her without effort, the way anything does when you've carried it long enough. The expected recovery curve for the implant series specified in the Halloran contract was modeled on civilian orthopedic data for dogs between 4 and 7 years old. Standard post-op outcome at 90 days was roughly 78% restored mobility. What I was seeing in theater was closer to 44%. Across 31 dogs, Kowalski said. Across the ones I had direct access to. I estimated the broader population was worse. I didn't have access to the full Theater K9 medical database. That was above my clearance level. But the sample I had was statistically significant enough to flag. You flagged it. I flagged it. Colonel Wade told me I was misreading the data. He said field conditions introduced confounding variables that made direct comparison to clinical benchmarks unreliable. She paused. He wasn't wrong about the confounding variables. He was wrong about their magnitude. I ran the analysis 3 ways, adjusting for the variables he cited, and the gap held in all 3 models. Decker had been making up. You have the analysis in the files you just handed us? All three versions, annotated. He looked at Kowalski. Something passed between them that Emily couldn't read precisely but understood generally. The recognition of something that had been missing and was now present. Kodiak's chart, Kowalski said. The secondary injury you identified, the iliac compression. I documented it yesterday morning before Holt pulled me off floor duties. It's in the patient record. Emily leaned forward slightly. Whoever took him, they either want the dog as leverage or they want to destroy the physical evidence. If they're thinking about the latter, they need to know that the injury is already documented. The records exist independently of the animal. They may not know that, Decker said. Then they're working with incomplete information. Emily sat back. Find the van. We're working it, Kowalski said. How far does this go? Emily asked. You said network. You said officials. Plural. Give me a number. Kowalski and Decker exchanged another look. We have 23 individuals currently under investigation, Decker said. Ranging from procurement officers to contracting executives to... He stopped. To what? Emily said. To a 2-star general, Kowalski said. Brigadier General Roy Stemfield, currently serving in an advisory capacity to the Joint Chiefs Medical Supply Oversight Committee. The room was very quiet. Emily had suspected, that it went high. The speed with which her 2019 report had been closed, the efficiency with which the appeals had been denied, the fact that Colonel Wade had walked into a consulting contract 3 months after killing her complaint. None of that happened without altitude. But a general, a sitting advisory general with access to the committee that oversaw the contract she'd tried to blow open. He was on the oversight committee in 2019, she said. He was the deputy chair, Kowalski said. Emily said nothing for a moment. He signed off on the renewal, she said. The contract renewed in November 2019, 8 months after your report was filed and closed. Stemfield signed the renewal authorization. The contract ran for another 3 years. Kowalski's voice was careful and precise, the way someone sounds when they've been living inside a set of facts long enough to know exactly which ones will land the hardest. During that 3-year extension, an additional 7 dogs received the counterfeit implants. 7 more, on top of the 11. Emily did the math without wanting to and set it down somewhere she wasn't going to look at directly. You need the chain, she said, Wade to Stemfield. We need the chain from Halloran to Stemfield, with Wade as a documented link. Your 2019 report gives us the earliest documented evidence of the fraud. Wade's decision to close it, cross-referenced with his subsequent employment at Halloran, gives us the corruption link. Stemfield's renewal signature closes the loop at the top. But you don't have Stemfield directly. Not yet. Emily looked at the table. She thought about Kodiak somewhere in a white van in Nebraska. She thought about Dale Morrow in Ward 2, lying in a hospital bed with a pulmonary embolism because he'd been sitting in a truck for too many hours, because he couldn't afford not to work, because the VA had denied his dog's surgical coverage, because someone had deliberately documented that injury as pre-existing. She thought about a tent in August and a dog named Ruckus and a set of numbers that didn't add up, and a report she'd filed, and the look on Colonel Wade's face when he'd called her into his office. Not angry, not guilty, just calm. The calm of a man who had already decided how the conversation was going to end. You're a good medic, Major, he'd said. Don't let this become a problem for your career. She'd let it become a problem for her career anyway. What do you need from me now? She asked. Kowalski said, Stay available. Stay inside the hospital until we've secured the scene. And if you're contacted again, I'll forward it immediately. Emily stood. Find the van. She walked back to the floor. She spent the next 2 hours moving through her patients with the complete focus of someone who had divided themselves precisely down the middle, one half in the work in front of her, one half tracking every variable she couldn't control. She knew this division. She'd lived in it for years in a different context, and the thing she'd learned about it was that it was sustainable for longer than seemed possible, and then it wasn't sustainable at all, and you didn't always know which side of that line you were on until the moment you fell. At 10:40 a.m., Foss brought her the keycard access log. She was at the nurse's station. She took the printout and looked at it without sitting down. The exterior corridor door on Ward 2 had been accessed 4 times in the last 24 hours. 2 of them were during normal ward rounds, staff she recognized. A third was at 6:55 a.m. that morning, which matched the time frame of Kodiak's disappearance. The fourth was at 11:34 p.m. the previous night. The card ID on the 11:34 p.m. entry read, Bauer, T. Environmental Services. Emily set the printout down on the desk and looked at it for a moment. She knew Terry Bauer. Not well. He was overnight maintenance. They'd crossed paths in the hallways. He'd once helped her find a mop when there was a spill outside Bay 4. Quiet man, mid-40s, worked nights because, he'd mentioned once, the days were complicated since his divorce. She picked up her phone and called Kowalski. I have a name, she said. Your records room was accessed at 11:34 last night by an environmental services employee named Terry Bauer. Same keycard accessed the exterior corridor this morning. You need to find him before he leaves the building. Is he still on shift? His shift ended at 7 a.m. Emily looked at the clock. He's been gone for almost 4 hours. A pause. We'll get a location. You did good. Emily ended the call and put the printout in her jacket pocket. She stood at the nurse's station for a moment, aware that Renata was watching her from across the desk, and deliberately not asking the question her face was clearly asking. How's your morning? Renata said finally. Fine, Emily said, which was so far from the truth that it almost functioned as its own kind of honesty. She went back to work. She checked on a post-cardiac patient in room 118. She reviewed labs for a woman in 121 who was recovering from a reaction that had initially presented as something more serious and turned out to be medication-related, which Emily had flagged on day 1 and which Holt had agreed with on day 2. She did the work. She stayed inside it. At 11:15 a.m., Kowalski appeared at the end of the corridor and gave Emily a single nod. They found the van. That was what the nod meant. Emily waited until her medication pass was finished. Then she walked to the conference room. The van had been recovered from a long-term parking lot at a regional airport 40 miles east of Caldwell. It was empty. No dog, no driver, 2 sets of boot prints in the dried mud near the rear doors, and a cell phone on the front seat that was almost certainly a burner. The plates were stolen. A garage in Omaha had reported them missing 3 weeks ago. He was transferred, Decker said. Second vehicle. Probably in the air by now or an hour from now. Emily processed this. Where? We don't know yet. We're working with TSA and FAA. He looked at her. Whoever did this had resources. This wasn't improvised. No, Emily said. It wasn't. She thought about the timeline. The agents had arrived yesterday. The records room was breached last night. The text came at 2:17 a.m. Kodiak was taken at approximately 6:55 a.m., each step escalating, each step faster than the one before. This wasn't panic. This was a managed retreat. Someone with operational capability, and a clear objective pulling loose threads as fast as they could identify them. Terry Bauer, she said, Environmental Services. We picked him up 40 minutes ago at a gas station on Route 6. He's not talking. Who does he work for? Outside the hospital. We're running it. Decker closed his laptop. The question now is whether whoever orchestrated this is going to keep pulling threads. They will, Emily said. You sound certain. Because the documentation I gave you this morning changes the calculus for them significantly. Before this morning, your case was built on current evidence. Kodiak's records, the serial numbers, Morrow's complaint. My 2019 files put a named officer closing a fraud report 8 months before a fraudulent contract renewal. That changes what Stemfield is looking at from a procurement violation to a conspiracy with a documented timeline. She looked at Decker steadily. If I were him, I would be very motivated right now. Decker looked at Kowalski. We need to move faster, Kowalski said, mostly to herself. There's a problem, Emily said. Both agents looked at her. Kodiak needs surgery. I told Dale Morrow I would get him scheduled by end of the week. If the dog is missing... She stopped, started differently. The internal implant is fractured. Depending on how he's being transported, how much stress he's under, the fragment could migrate. If it does, it will cause additional joint damage and potentially vascular complications depending on where it moves. She kept her clinical register because it was the most useful thing she had. He doesn't have unlimited time. We understand, Kowalski said. I need you to understand it specifically. This isn't a matter of the dog being uncomfortable. This is a progressive injury in a stressed animal under unknown transport conditions, and the window for a clean surgical outcome narrows the longer he's in motion. We're working every lead we have. Work faster, Emily said, and stood up. She was halfway to the door when Decker said, "Dr. Reeves." She stopped. "The analysis you did in 2019." He said it carefully. "The three versions, adjusting for confounding variables. You said the gap held in all three models." "It did." "What was your margin of error?" Emily turned around. "At 95% confidence, the observed mobility recovery rate for Halloran-implanted dogs was between 38 and 51%. Expected rate was 74 to 82%. The gap was not within any reasonable margin of error under any of the three models." She paused. "The implants were failing at approximately twice the rate of spec-compliant hardware. I knew that in 2019. Colonel Wade knew it when I showed him the analysis." Decker wrote something down. Emily left. The afternoon was the longest stretch of the 3 days she'd been inside this. Holt reinstated her clinical duties formally at noon. A brief, somewhat uncomfortable conversation in which he'd said, "I'd like to put this morning behind us," and she'd said sure, and they'd both known it wasn't actually behind either of them, but had agreed to table it, which was its own kind of progress. She worked through 4 patients she'd been worried about, and 2 she'd been less worried about, and found she'd been right in all 6 cases, which was satisfying in the purely clinical way things were satisfying when everything else was uncertain. At 2:30 p.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not a text this time. A call. She stepped into the stairwell and answered. "Dr. Reeves." A man's voice. Older, careful. The voice of someone who was accustomed to being the most composed person in any room. "I think it's time we spoke directly." She kept her voice neutral. "Who is this?" "Someone who has been watching your career with considerable interest for the last 6 years." A pause. "You've been very patient. I'm going to need a name." "I think you already know enough to have a reasonable guess." She did. She didn't say it. "Here's what I want you to understand," the man said. "What you're doing, cooperating with this investigation, it feels like justice. I understand that. You were wronged. Your work was dismissed. I understand the appeal of what's being offered to you right now." His voice was measured, almost gentle, the way someone sounds when they're genuinely trying to persuade rather than threaten. "But the people you're working with don't have the full picture of what that report would have cost if it had moved forward in 2019. The programs it would have disrupted, the operational capacity that would have been compromised, the dogs that would have lived," Emily said. Silence. "You're digging into people," he said, and the gentleness was gone now, replaced by something older and colder, "who have been in positions you can't imagine, making decisions you don't have the context to judge. Then give me the context." "That's not how this works." "No," Emily said. "Here's how this works. You called my personal cell phone, which means you have my number, which means someone gave it to you in the last 24 hours. This call is being recorded." She wasn't recording it. She had her second phone out and was attempting to initiate a recording while she spoke, which was taking slightly longer than she wanted. "Whatever you say in the next 30 seconds is going into a federal file, so I'd suggest making it count." A long pause. "You should know," he said, "that what you think you're protecting, the dog, the handler, the case, there are pieces of this you haven't found yet, and some of them are in your hospital right now." The line went dead. Emily stood in the stairwell for 4 seconds. Then she called Kowalski and relayed the conversation word for word, from memory, in the order it had happened. Kowalski said, "Say that last part again." Emily said, "He said some of the pieces I haven't found yet are in this hospital right now." A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. "Get to the records room," Kowalski said. "Right now. Don't go alone." Emily was already moving. She pushed out of the stairwell onto the second floor and covered the distance to the records room in under a minute, Renata behind her because Renata had seen her face and followed without being asked. The yellow security tape was still across the door. Emily pulled it aside, used her key card, she still had full access, Summer hadn't revoked it, and pushed the door open. The light was already on. The filing cabinet that had been disturbed the previous night was open again. And on the floor, tucked against the base of the third cabinet in a manila envelope that was not the one Emily had taken from this room, was a document she recognized. Not the format, not the specific pages, but the structure of it, the particular bureaucratic architecture of a military internal audit closure memo. And on the top page, in the signature block, was a name she had last seen at the bottom of a denial letter 6 years ago. She crouched and looked at it without touching it. The name was Stemfield, and beneath his signature, a second signature she had not expected. Someone who wasn't in Kowalski's file. Someone who wasn't in the chain she'd built in her head over 6 years of carrying this. A name attached to a position that made the room feel like it had shifted on its axis. Because this person was not a military official, was not a contractor, was not anyone who should have been anywhere near a K9 medical supply audit in 2019. This person was the current deputy director of the Defense Health Agency. And above their signature, in the box labeled Authorized Reviewer, was a date stamp. 3 weeks ago. She didn't touch the document. That was the first discipline. Don't touch, don't move, don't alter the chain of custody by 1 degree. She'd learned that the hard way in a different context, a different building, a different version of herself, who had picked up a piece of paper she shouldn't have touched, and spent 3 months explaining why to people who had already decided the explanation didn't matter. She straightened up and looked at Renata. Go get Kowalski, second floor conference room. Tell her records room, right now. Renata left without asking questions, which was one of the things Emily had come to value most about her. Emily stood in the doorway of the records room and looked at the envelope on the floor and thought about what it meant that it was there. The room had been sealed with security tape since that morning. Her keycard access log would show 2 entries, the original seal by Foss and her entry just now, which meant either Foss had missed the envelope during his initial sweep, which was possible if someone had placed it against the base of the cabinet where the shadow fell wrong, or someone had been in this room between the sealing and her arrival, which would require another keycard entry, which would be on the log. She pulled out her phone and called Foss directly. The records room on 2, she said when he answered. I need the full keycard log, every entry today. Right now, please. A pause. I just sent that to the Federal. I know. I need you to read it to me. He read it. 3 entries since Foss had placed the tape at 7:45 a.m. Kowalski's team at 8:22 a.m. Emily at 2:47 p.m. and one other at 12:09 p.m. A card registered to Administrative Services, Summer, P. Patricia Summer. Emily didn't say anything for a moment. Thank you, she said, and ended the call. She stood in the doorway and looked at the document on the floor and thought about Patricia Summer, who had let the federal agents in that morning, who had handed over Emily's personnel file, who had suspended the administrative review at Emily's request, who had nodded along to every development with the expression of a woman trying to hold herself together under pressure. Patricia, who had access to every wing of this building. Patricia, who would know exactly which records had pre-digital military intake files and where they were stored. She thought about the calls she'd received in the stairwell. Some of them are in your hospital right now. She thought about the fact that Kowalski had not flagged Summer as a person of interest, which meant either Kowalski didn't know or Kowalski had known and hadn't told her, and she genuinely wasn't sure which of those was worse. Kowalski arrived in under 3 minutes, Decker behind her, and they both stopped in the doorway and looked at the envelope without going in. That wasn't here this morning, Kowalski said. No. Emily handed her phone to Kowalski with the Notes app open, where she'd typed the keycard sequence from memory while waiting. 3rd entry, Patricia Summer, 12:09. Kowalski read it. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small recalibration, the kind that happened when a variable you'd thought was stable turned out not to be. Where is she now? Kowalski asked. I don't know. Decker was already on his radio. Kowalski stepped carefully into the room, gloves already on. She'd had them in her jacket pocket, which told Emily she'd come expecting to need them, and crouched next to the envelope. She looked at the signature page without touching it, and Emily watched her read the names and watched the slight tightening around Kowalski's eyes when she got to the second signature. Harlan Voss, Kowalski said quietly, mostly to herself. Deputy Director of the Defense Health Agency, Emily said. I know who he is. 3 weeks ago, he reviewed and authorized something connected to a 2019 fraud audit that was supposed to be closed and buried. Emily kept her voice even. Which means someone pulled that audit recently. Someone with enough access to retrieve a classified closure memo and add a current authorization signature. Which means the audit was reopened, Kowalski said. Internally, without us. Or it was reopened specifically because someone knew you were getting close and wanted to get ahead of it. Kowalski stood up and looked at Emily with an expression she hadn't used before. Not the careful professional neutrality of the first 2 days, but something more direct. The look of someone dropping the managed distance because the situation had moved past where it was useful. "How long have you been thinking this through?" Kowalski asked. "Since the stairwell," Emily said. 12 minutes. Decker came back to the door. "Summer's not in her office. Her assistant says she left for a lunch appointment at noon and hasn't returned." None of them said anything for a moment. "Put her on the board," Kowalski said to Decker. Then to Emily. "I need you to think about anyone else in this building who has had access to your movements, your documentation, or your conversations with us in the last 48 hours. Emily thought about it carefully, the way she thought about patient presentations, ruling out, narrowing, not jumping to the diagnosis that felt right, but following the actual evidence. Renata Osei knows most of what's happened on the floor level, but she doesn't have administrative access, and I'd stake a significant amount on her not being involved. Foss has keycard data, but doesn't know the content of what we've discussed. Holt knows I was interviewed by federal agents and that my review was suspended, but I haven't told him anything substantive." She paused. "Summer was present for our initial conversation in the conference room. She would have heard the scope of what you were investigating." "She was in the room?" Decker said. "She walked Kowalski's team to the conference room. I don't know how long she stayed in the corridor." Decker and Kowalski exchanged a look that Emily understood to mean they'd made an operational error in not clearing the hallway before the conversation started. "We need to find her," Kowalski said. "I know." Emily looked at the envelope on the floor. "But first, that document. If Voss authorized a review 3 weeks ago, it means someone inside the Defense Health Agency is trying to build a parallel record. Something that predates your investigation. Something that could be used to argue the fraud was being addressed internally and that external prosecution is an overreach." Kowalski looked at her. "They're not just trying to destroy evidence," Emily said. "They're trying to replace it with a controlled version." The silence in the room had a specific weight to it, the weight of a thing becoming clear that had been blurry for too long. "Get a forensic team in here," Kowalski said to Decker. "Full sweep. I want to know if there's anything else in this room that wasn't here this morning." She stepped back into the hallway and pulled Emily with her by the simple expedient of tilting her head toward the corridor and walking. Emily followed. "Here's where we are," Kowalski said, her voice low and direct. "We have your 2019 documentation, which is solid. We have Kodiak's records, which are solid. We have the serial number cross-reference linking Halloran's hardware to 11 documented dogs, 3 of them dead. We have Wade's employment timeline. We have Stemfield's renewal signature." She paused. "What we don't have is a direct link from Stemfield to Halloran's executive level that will survive a federal prosecution without being challenged. What does that link look like? Financial, payments, transfers, anything that shows Stemfield received value in exchange for the renewal authorization. You've been looking for it. For 8 months. We've traced 2 offshore accounts that show movement during the relevant period, but the ownership trail is structured to be difficult. Halloran's CEO, a man named Curtis Braille, used a layered holding structure. We can see the shape of it, but we can't prove the terminal ownership without either a confession or a document we haven't been able to locate." Emily thought about this. "There's a document type in military procurement that doesn't get digitized," she said. "Supplemental authorization letters. When a contract renewal includes non-standard terms, modifications that deviate from the original bid specs, a supplemental authorization is required. Physical signature, 2 copies, one goes to the contractor, one to the approving officer's personal file." Kowalski was very still. "The supplemental for the 2019 renewal," Emily said. "If the terms were modified, if Halloran's hardware specifications were quietly downgraded as part of the renewal, there would be a supplemental letter. Stemfield's personal file would have a copy. His personal file is classified. His personal file can be subpoenaed with sufficient cause. We'd need a federal judge to agree we have sufficient cause. You have a 2019 fraud report that a colonel closed in exchange for a consulting contract, a renewal signed by a general with documented ties to the contractor's financial network, 11 dogs with counterfeit implants, and a document that just appeared in a sealed room bearing signatures dated 3 weeks ago that suggest active internal interference with a federal investigation." Emily looked at Kowalski steadily. "Is that sufficient cause?" Kowalski pulled out her phone. She walked 6 steps down the corridor, made a call, spoke for approximately 90 seconds, and came back. Our federal prosecutor is filing for the subpoena in the next 2 hours, she said. Emily nodded. In the meantime, Kowalski said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it carefully before you answer. All right. The man who called you in the stairwell. The voice. Walk me through it again. Not what he said, the voice itself. Age, register, any regional marker, any speech pattern that stood out. Emily closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She'd been doing this since the call ended, running the recording she kept in her head, the habit of retention that she'd built over years of environments where you couldn't always write things down. Older, 60 or above, no regional accent, or one that had been worked out, the kind of flat neutral you hear in people who've spent their careers in institutional settings where regional markers get smoothed away. He chose his words carefully, not in the way of someone nervous about being recorded, in the way of someone who is accustomed to precision. She opened her eyes. He said operational capacity. He said context. He talked about decisions made in positions I couldn't imagine. That's the language of someone who has been in command long enough that he thinks of authority as a kind of geography, as if some people are simply in a place where the rules that apply to others don't reach. Kowalski was watching her. That's not Braille, Emily said. That's not a contractor. That's a career officer. Stemfield is 63, Kowalski said. No regional accent. Emily said nothing. If he called you directly, Kowalski said, it means he's panicking, or it means he's decided to handle this personally rather than through intermediaries, which is what people do when they've lost confidence in the intermediaries. Terry Bauer didn't deliver, Emily said. Summer may have told him that the documentation was already in federal hands, which means his leverage options are narrowing. Emily thought about Kodiak, somewhere she didn't know, in a condition she couldn't monitor. He still has the dog. Yes. Which means he still thinks the dog is useful to him, as long as he thinks that... She stopped. He'll keep the dog alive, Kowalski said. Where does Stemfield operate out of? What's his location? He has an office at the Pentagon and a home in Northern Virginia, but he's not there. Kowalski's jaw tightened slightly. His office reported him out on a personal travel day. His home security system shows no activity since yesterday morning. He's mobile, Emily said, which is consistent with someone managing an active operation. Emily thought about the call. The way it had been handled, composed, unhurried, the words chosen for maximum effect with minimum exposure. The suggestion at the end that things were still in motion, that there were pieces she hadn't found. That had not been the call of someone running. That had been the call of someone who believed he was still in control of the situation. She looked at her watch, 3:14 p.m. I need to check on my patients, she said. Kowalski looked at her for a moment as if she was going to say something else and then didn't. Stay on the floor. Don't go anywhere in the building alone. Emily went back to work. The next hour and 40 minutes were the strangest of the 3 days because they were, on the surface, completely ordinary. She checked labs. She reviewed a discharge summary. She sat with a 47-year-old woman named Gloria Prentice, who was scared about going home after her cardiac event, and who didn't need medical information so much as she needed someone to sit in the chair next to her bed and be present, which Emily did for 11 minutes, which was longer than she could technically afford, and which she did anyway because Gloria's daughter lived in Phoenix, and the ward was not going to run short on anything in 11 minutes. She was at the nurse's station at 4:52 p.m. when her phone buzzed. Kowalski. Subpoena granted. Marshals executing on Stemfield's Pentagon office now. His aide just lawyered up. Stemfield himself is still unlocated. Then 40 seconds later, Braille was picked up at O'Hare in custody. Emily read both messages twice. She set the phone down on the desk. She was aware that Renata was watching her from 2 feet away and making no pretense of doing anything else. Good news or bad? Renata asked. Some of each, Emily said. Braille's arrest meant the contractor end was closed. It meant the financial records that Kowalski's team had been unable to access through the layered holding structure could now be subpoenaed directly, because Curtis Braille in federal custody was a different legal landscape than Curtis Braille conducting business. It meant the shape of the fraud, the counterfeit hardware, the documentation, the payments, was now a matter of formal record, rather than investigative theory. What it didn't mean was Stemfield. A contractor's arrest didn't compel a general officer's cooperation, and Stemfield was still mobile, still unlocated, still the person who had authorized the renewal, still the person whose personal file contained the supplemental letter that would close the financial link, if it existed, if it hadn't been destroyed. And Kodiak was still gone. At 5:30 p.m., Decker appeared on the ward floor looking for her, which was unusual enough that 3 nurses tracked his path to the nurses' station with undisguised attention. "We found something in the records room," he said. "I need you to look at something." She followed him to the second floor. The forensic team had finished. The room smelled of the particular chemical flatness of evidence processing: gloves, evidence bags, the faint trace of the powder used for surface prints. The filing cabinet was fully open now, all drawers, and on the table in the center of the room there was a clear evidence bag containing a small rectangular device. Emily looked at it. "GSM module," Decker said. "Transmitter." It was taped to the underside of the second drawer behind the false back panel. "We almost missed it." "How long has it been there?" "We don't know yet. Days. Possibly longer." He looked at her. "It was transmitting." Emily stood very still. "Active transmission," he said, "which means someone has been listening to conversations in this room. Our conversation this morning. Whatever Kowalski's team discussed when they processed the scene at 8:22. Emily thought about what had been said in that room. The serial numbers, the statistical analysis, the discussion of what evidence they had and what they still needed. "They knew what you were building," she said. "They knew what was missing," Decker said. "They knew we didn't have the financial link to Stemfield. Which is why he called me." She said it slowly, fitting the pieces into the sequence. "He listened to the morning conversation. He knew exactly where the gaps were. He called me because he thought if he could rattle me, if he could suggest that the investigation was going to fall short, that the people he was connected to were untouchable, I might pull back." "Or," Decker said, "he called you because he wanted to hear your voice, to assess how committed you were, to decide whether you were manageable. And you told him the call was being recorded." "I wasn't recording it. He didn't know that." Decker looked at her steadily. "After that call, he went quiet. No further contact attempts. No movement on any of the channels we're monitoring." He paused. "We think he changed his approach." "To what?" "That's what we're trying to determine." Emily looked at the transmitter in its evidence bag on the table. She thought about Summer, who was still missing. She thought about this document on the floor with Voss's signature. She thought about the particular architecture of what had been done here. The transmitter planted in the records room, the records room access at midnight, the file cabinets, the document left on the floor. Not destruction, not erasure, replacement. "The document Summer left," Emily said, "the one with Voss's signature. You said it looks like an attempt to build a parallel record, to suggest the fraud was being addressed internally." "Yes." "What if it's not just a defense strategy? What if it's bait?" Decker looked at her. "Voss's signature on that document dated 3 weeks ago means Voss is exposed," Emily said. "If that document enters the federal record, Voss becomes a subject. His communications, his files, his authorization chain become discoverable." She worked through it out loud because working through it out loud was faster than working through it alone. "Stemfield is 63. He's facing a procurement fraud conspiracy charge, potential RICO elements, 3 dogs dead under circumstances that are going to look very bad in a courtroom. He needs to reduce his exposure." "By exposing Voss?" "By making sure Voss's name is in the federal record before Stemfield is indicted. If Voss goes down too, Stemfield's legal team argues shared culpability, distributes the accountability." "He planted the document to implicate his own co-conspirator," Decker said. "He's cleaning house," Emily said. "The people who are useful to him are the ones who stay loyal, the ones who become liabilities." She stopped. "Where is Voss right now?" Decker was already reaching for his radio. The answer came back in 4 minutes. Deputy Director Harlan Voss had been unreachable since that morning. His office had assumed he was in meetings. His assistant had stopped being able to locate him around noon. Emily thought about the timeline. Summer in the records room at 12:09 p.m., Voss going dark around the same time, Stemfield mobile unlocated, managing his exposure. She thought about the transmitter in the records room and the fact that Stemfield had been listening to the federal team all morning. She thought about what a man who had spent a career in command positions would do when he'd concluded that the investigation was going to reach him regardless, and that his best remaining option was to arrive at the table before he was dragged to it. At 6:15 p.m., her phone rang. Phone rang, Kowalski. "We found Stemfield," Kowalski said. Emily waited. He walked into the FBI field office in Omaha 45 minutes ago, with a lawyer and a hard drive. Kowalski's voice had a quality Emily hadn't heard in it before. Not surprise, but something that was the aftermath of surprise. The sound of someone reorganizing their understanding of a situation in real time. "He's offering to cooperate. Full testimony. Names, financial records, communication logs." Emily pressed her back against the wall of the corridor and looked at the ceiling. "In exchange for what?" she asked. "Reduced sentencing consideration and immunity for anything related to Voss." He's giving them Voss. He's giving them Voss, three other officials in the Defense Health Agency, 2 procurement officers, and the full financial architecture of the Halloran contract. Kowalski paused. "Including a supplemental authorization letter for the 2019 renewal that modifies the hardware specifications from military grade to civilian grade. Stemfield signed it, and apparently kept a personal copy." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. "The dog," she said. "I'm getting to that." Kowalski's voice shifted. "Stemfield's lawyer disclosed the location of the animal as part of the cooperation package. He's at a private veterinary facility in Council Bluffs. He's alive. He's been sedated. They claimed for transport stress. But the vet on site says he's stable." Emily opened her eyes. "I need the name of the facility," she said. "Emily, I need the name of the facility and I need the contact information for the vet on site, because that dog has a fractured internal implant and I need to know if the sedation protocol is contraindicated for his current orthopedic condition." A pause. Then Kowalski gave her both. Emily ended the call and immediately dialed the Council Bluffs number. A woman answered, young, uncertain, clearly not having a good afternoon, and Emily identified herself as the treating clinician from Harlow General, which was almost but not entirely true, and asked for a description of the sedation agent and dosage used, the dog's current vitals, and whether any weight-bearing movement had been required during transport. The vet on site was a man named Dr. Pellegrino, who came on the line after 2 minutes and who was, fortunately, competent and willing to talk. He gave her the sedation protocol. She asked about the hip. He said he'd noticed the abnormal gait before sedation. She walked him through the iliac compression, what to look for, what to avoid, what position the animal needed to be in for the next several hours. "He needs orthopedic surgery," she said. "Within 72 hours ideally. I have a referral already arranged at the University Hospital in Lincoln." "Federal agents are on their way here," Pellegrino said. "What happens after they arrive?" "After they arrive, the dog is in federal custody and he needs to be transported to Lincoln. I'll coordinate with the surgical team." She ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment with her phone in her hand. Dale Morrow was in room 224. She walked there without deciding to. He was awake. He was sitting up, which was better than this morning. The TV was on with the sound off, which was what he did when he couldn't sleep and didn't want noise. He looked at her when she came in and read her face the way people read faces when they've spent enough time in situations where faces carried the information before words did. "Kodiak," he said. "He's alive," she said. "He's stable. He's in Council Bluffs. Federal agents are picking him up right now." Dale's shoulders dropped about an inch, which on a man like him was equivalent to anyone else collapsing into a chair. "He needs surgery," Emily said. "I've already made the referral. Lincoln, end of the week, orthopedic team that knows what they're doing. The VA is going to cover it." She paused. "I'm going to make sure the VA covers it." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him steadily. "I want to." He looked at her for a moment with the expression he'd had yesterday, that careful, deliberate look. "They told me you had documentation, from 2019, that you'd kept it all this time." "Yes." "Why?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the January ritual of paying the server maintenance fee. She thought about the manila envelope in the false bottom of the storage box. She thought about what it means to hold on to something for years without letting yourself fully think about why. "Because throwing it away would have felt like agreeing with them," she said. Dale was quiet. Then he said, "My second deployment. We lost a dog. Ranger, Belgian Mal, 7 years old, IED. Nothing anyone could have done. But when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened after. How the paperwork was handled, how the records were filed, how nothing in the official account matched what I'd actually seen. He stopped. Nobody wanted to hear it. I tried twice, and both times I got the same look, like I was inconvenient. He looked at the window, the dark outside. You're the first person in a long time who didn't give me that look. Emily didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for her. She settled for, get some sleep. You're still on anticoagulants, and your pressure has been marginal all day. Yes, Major, he said. She stopped in the doorway. She hadn't been called that in 6 years. She didn't correct him. She walked back to the nurse's station and sat down and opened the shift notes and started charting. Around her, the floor moved through its late evening rhythms. Quieter now, the particular stillness of a hospital after the day's intensity had passed through. Renata brought her coffee without being asked. She drank it. At 7:40 p.m., Kowalski found her at the station and sat down in the chair beside her, which was unusual because Kowalski hadn't sat down in Emily's presence since the first conference room meeting. Stemfield's deposition starts tomorrow morning, Kowalski said. His lawyer is negotiating the terms tonight. Will it hold? If he delivers what he says he has, yes. The financial records alone will close the case against Braille and give us the chain we needed for the other officials. She paused. Voss was picked up an hour ago in Washington. He's not cooperating. That's actually fine. We don't need him to. Emily nodded. Summer, Kowalski said. Emily looked at her. She's in federal custody. She turned herself in at 4 o'clock, also with a lawyer. Kowalski's voice was even. She wasn't a primary operative. She was being pressured. There's a financial angle we're still working through. She accessed the records room because someone told her the document needed to be placed there before the forensic team swept it. She paused. She was used. Emily thought about Summer in her office that morning, the tablet pressed to her chest, the anxiety that had read as guilt, but might have been something more complicated. Is she going to be all right? That depends on how cooperative she is. Kowalski looked at her. The hospital will have to decide what to do with her position. Emily nodded slowly. One more thing, Kowalski said. She reached into her jacket and put a small rectangle on the desk. A flash drive, standard issue, government label on the side. The drive you gave me this morning, we copied everything. This is the original, returned to you per chain of custody protocol. She paused. What you built in 2019, the analysis, the cross-references, the outcome data, it's the foundation of the entire federal case. Without it, we have a fraud with no beginning. With it, we have a conspiracy with a timeline and a paper trail and a named officer who made a deliberate decision to bury it. She met Emily's eyes. You should have that back. Emily picked up the drive and held it for a moment. She thought about 2019. She thought about the tent in August, the numbers that didn't add up, the report she'd filed and the meeting with Wade and the particular feeling of watching something true get set aside because truth was inconvenient. She thought about 18 years ending in a letter that used words like insubordination and circumvention as if they were character flaws rather than descriptions of what you did when the institution failed the people it was supposed to protect. She put the drive in her pocket. Thank you, she said. Kowalski stood up. She looked like someone who had been awake for 36 hours and was going to be awake for 36 more and had made a separate peace with that fact. Try to get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. She left. Emily sat at the nurse's station for another few minutes. The floor was quiet. The monitors were steady. Through the window at the end of the corridor, the Nebraska night was clear and very dark, the kind of dark you only got this far from any real city. She picked up her phone. She called the veterinary surgical team in Lincoln and spoke for 8 minutes with the orthopedic resident about what Pellegrino had told her, about the iliac compression pattern, about the timeline for transport and intake. She confirmed the appointment. She gave them Kodiak's case number. She hung up and sat for a moment and was about to stand and start her final round when her phone buzzed one more time. Not Kowalski. Not Decker. Not a number she recognized. A text, 4 words. Check Stemfield's discharge file. She stared at the message. Not a threat this time. Not a warning. A direction, specific and surgical, from a number that when she ran it backward through the hospital directory returned a result she hadn't expected. the extension for the overnight administrative processing office, a number that was not assigned to any individual employee but was accessible from any administrative terminal in the building. Someone inside Harlow General, right now, was telling her to look at something, and whoever it was didn't want to be identified. She sat with the text for 10 seconds, which was long enough to decide that whoever sent it was either genuinely trying to help or genuinely trying to redirect her attention, and that the only way to find out which was to look. She forwarded the text to Kowalski with a single line. "Someone inside the building just sent this. I'm going to check it. Are you still on site?" Kowalski replied in under a minute. "In the parking lot. Don't go alone." Emily walked to the end of the corridor and found Renata finishing a chart at the secondary station. "Come with me," she said. "I need a witness." Renata didn't ask why. She logged out of the terminal and followed. The medical records department on the ground floor kept physical discharge files in a secondary archive, separate from the main records room, older cases, closed admissions, anything predating the electronic system's full implementation. Emily had been in there twice in 3 years, both times looking for historical medication records on readmitted patients. She knew where the veteran intake section was. She knew the files were organized by year and then alphabetically. STEM Field R wouldn't be hard to find if it was there. The department was unstaffed at this hour, the overnight clerk on break, the door unlocked because the hospital's after-hours access policy was, as Emily had learned over the last 72 hours, considerably more porous than anyone had wanted to acknowledge. She used her keycard. The light inside was motion-activated and came on in sections as they moved through the rows. Veteran intake. She found the section. She ran her finger along the tabs without touching the folders themselves, reading the years. 2009, 2010, 2011. She moved faster. 2016. She slowed. STEM Field, Roy A. The tab was there, a standard manila folder, thinner than she expected. She crouched and looked at it without pulling it. The folder had a routing stamp on the edge that indicated it had been accessed recently. Not decades ago, not years. The ink on the access stamp was still sharp. "Renata," she said. "I see it," Renata said. Emily called Kowalski. "Ground floor records archive, veteran intake section. You need to come down here." Kowalski arrived in 4 minutes with Decker behind her and gloves already on. Emily and Renata stepped back. Kowalski pulled the folder, opened it on the archive table, and read in silence for a moment. Then she said, "He was a patient here." Emily hadn't known that. She hadn't guessed it. She looked at the top of the file, an admission record dated 11 years ago, pre-Emily's time at Harlow General. A surgical consult, orthopedic. "Hip replacement," Decker said, reading over Kowalski's shoulder. 11 years ago. Civilian procedure, personal insurance, not VA. He turned a page. "Hardware supplier listed in the surgical record." He stopped. Emily already knew what he was going to say. "Halloran Defense Solutions," he said. The archive was very quiet. "He was their customer before he was their beneficiary," Kowalski said slowly. Not to either of them specifically. To the room, to the shape of the thing that was becoming visible. His own hip hardware, civilian grade from the same manufacturer, 11 years ago. "Which means he knew the quality," Emily said. "Personally. He knew what Halloran was capable of producing, and he authorized them to supply military-grade hardware to working dogs anyway." "Or," Decker said, and his voice had the careful texture of someone building a legal argument while they spoke, "he authorized the civilian-grade hardware for military use specifically because he already knew it. Because he had a pre-existing relationship with the company through his own medical care, which is an undisclosed conflict of interest on the 2019 renewal authorization." "That's not just fraud," Kowalski said. "That's a material conflict of interest that should have disqualified him from the renewal decision entirely." Emily stood back and looked at the open folder under the archive light and thought about what it meant for a man to sign off on equipment for animals, for working dogs doing the same job as soldiers, taking the same risks, while knowing from personal experience exactly what that equipment was worth. She didn't let herself say what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was not clinical and not legal and wouldn't help anyone. She set it down in the particular place she kept things that were too big and too ugly to carry around. "Can you use it?" she asked. "The undisclosed conflict of interest goes directly into the supplemental letter argument," Kowalski said. It invalidates the renewal authorization, which means the 3-year contract extension that allowed the fraud to continue was legally void from the moment Stemfield signed it. She closed the folder carefully. This is the piece we didn't have. We could prove he authorized the renewal. We couldn't prove he had prior knowledge of the product quality. She looked at Emily. This proves he did. Renata, who had been standing near the door in silence for the last several minutes, said quietly, "Who sent you here?" Nobody answered for a moment. "Someone who knew the file existed," Emily said. "Someone with access to administrative records, including discharge files." "And who wanted it found by us," Decker said, "rather than by whoever's been removing things." "Summer," Renata said. Emily looked at her. "She turned herself in at 4, Renata said. "You told me that. She's in federal custody. But before she turned herself in," she paused. "She would have known about this file. She would have had access to it." "She sent me to it," Emily said. Not a question, working through it. "She cooperated, gave them the records room. But she didn't know what was in the discharge archive because it wasn't part of whatever she was told to do. She found it separately. Or she knew about it and was afraid to say it directly," Renata said. "And this was the only way she could tell you without it looking like she was the source." The archive hummed with the quiet of old paper and fluorescent light. Emily thought about Patricia Summer, the tablet held to her chest, the institutional loyalty that had made her useful to people who were willing to use her, the look on her face that morning that had been anxiety and maybe something else, something she hadn't been able to name at the time. Remorse, possibly. The specific remorse of someone who has helped with something they didn't fully understand and has spent the subsequent hours understanding it more completely than they wanted to. "It doesn't change what she did," Emily said. "No," Kowalski agreed, "but it changes what she decided to do after." Kowalski bagged the folder. She and Decker left to process it. Emily and Renata took the stairs back to the ward floor, and the conversation between them going up the stairs was nothing. The comfortable silence of two people who had been in the same building for the same 3 days and didn't need to debrief out loud. Emily finished her shift at 9 p.m. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. And then she turned on the lights and made tea and drank it, and then she went to bed and slept for 6 hours without interruption, which was more than she'd expected. The next 2 weeks moved at a different pace than the previous 3 days. Federal proceedings operated on their own timeline. Not slow, exactly, but deliberate in the way that things become deliberate when the evidence is solid and the pressure is to get it right rather than to get it fast. Curtis Braille, CEO of Halloran Defense Solutions, was indicted on 11 counts of federal procurement fraud and 3 counts of conspiracy. The financial records his arrest unlocked showed a payment structure that had run for 6 years, routed through the layered holding companies that Kowalski's team had been circling for 8 months, with Stemfield as the terminal recipient of a series of consulting fees paid to a company registered in his wife's maiden name. Roy Stemfield's cooperation deal was accepted. He testified for 2 days in the federal deposition. His testimony named Harlan Voss directly, and corroborated by the discharge file from Harlow General and the supplemental letter Stemfield himself had retained, was sufficient to indict Voss on charges of conspiracy and obstruction. Voss's refusal to cooperate served him poorly. His legal team's argument that the document in the records room had been planted collapsed when the chain of custody and the keycard log traced its placement directly to Summer, acting on instructions she'd received through a communication channel that Voss himself had established. Colonel Wade, retired, consulting, living in Virginia with his full pension and his Halloran contract, was indicted separately on charges of fraud and abuse of office. He gave an interview to his lawyer that was quoted extensively in the federal complaint, and the quotes read like a man who had spent years convincing himself that what he'd done was pragmatic rather than corrupt, and who was discovering that the distinction didn't hold up under oath. Patricia Summer resigned from Harlow General before the hospital could act on her position. She was charged with obstruction and accessory after the fact. Her lawyer negotiated a cooperation agreement, and she received a suspended sentence with 2 years probation. Emily didn't know how to feel about that, and she spent some time not knowing, and eventually decided that her job was not to feel a particular way about it and moved on. Terry Bauer, the environmental services employee who had opened the corridor door in the records room, was charged as an accessory and sentenced to 18 months. His connection to the operation turned out to be a financial one. He had debt, significant debt, and someone had found it and used it, which was so ordinary and so depressing that Emily spent about 30 seconds on it before putting it down for good. The fraudulent K-9 medical programs connected to the Halloran contract were formally audited by the Defense Health Agency under emergency review procedures. New leadership, Voss's office restructured, oversight mechanisms that should have caught this years earlier, now mandated at 3 separate points in the procurement chain. Emily read about it in a federal press release that Kowalski emailed her without comment. She read it twice. At Harlow General, the administrative review against Emily was formally withdrawn on a Tuesday morning. Holt told her himself, standing in the corridor outside the nursing supervisor's office, the same spot where the original conversation had happened. And he said it in the direct, slightly uncomfortable way of a man who had spent 2 weeks working through the gap between who he'd thought Emily was and who she actually was, and who had decided to be honest about the gap rather than talk around it. I handled the situation on the floor poorly, he said. The day Morrow came in. I should have listened to you earlier. Emily looked at him. You moved when it mattered. That's a generous read. It's an accurate one. She paused. He survived. That's the outcome that counts. Holt was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who found humility comfortable, which meant the effort was visible, and Emily found that she respected the effort more than she would have respected ease. There's a clinical leadership review scheduled for next month, he said. The pathway you applied to twice. I'd like you to reapply. Emily didn't answer immediately. I'm not offering it to you, he said quickly, reading her expression correctly. I'm saying I'd like you to apply. The committee reviews, it goes through the normal process. He paused. But this time I won't be writing an assessment that says insufficient supervisory experience. She looked at him for a moment. What will you write? He almost smiled. The truth, he said, which is considerably more interesting than anything I've written before. Emily said, I'll think about it. She thought about it for 3 days and then submitted the application on a Thursday afternoon, between a medication pass and a chart review, without making a ceremony of it. Kodiak's surgery happened on a Friday, 6 days after the federal agents recovered him from the Council Bluffs facility. The orthopedic team in Lincoln removed the fractured implant, cleaned the joint, and placed a hardware-compliant replacement, the actual military spec version, the one that had been specified in the original contract and never delivered. The surgical resident called Emily afterward and said the procedure had gone well, which she took to mean it had gone imperfectly but successfully, which was how most things worth doing went. Dale Morrow was discharged from Harlow General on a Wednesday with anticoagulation therapy, a follow-up schedule, and a handwritten list of warning signs that Emily had given him because the discharge paperwork version wasn't specific enough, and she knew he wouldn't read it carefully enough if the font was small. He'd looked at the list, looked at her, and said, You wrote this yourself. The standard sheet leaves out 3 things I'd want to know, she said. That tracks, he said. He shook her hand at the door. He was bad at goodbyes, she could see that. The handshake was slightly too firm and lasted a beat too long, which was what happened when someone was trying to express more than a handshake could reasonably carry. She let it carry what it could and didn't try to add to it. Lincoln, she said. End of the month. Don't miss it. I won't, he said. And don't sit in the truck for more than 2 hours at a stretch. I mean it. Yes, Major, he said, for the second time, and this time she let herself smile because he'd earned it. He left. She watched him cross the parking lot, slower than he'd been when he arrived, more careful, the particular gait of someone who had recently learned that their body had been working against them and hadn't fully made their peace with that yet. He got into his truck and sat for a moment, and she could see through the windshield that he was doing something, looking down, probably at his phone or at the handwritten list. And then he put the truck in gear and left. The federal case moved through its phases with the machinery of federal proceedings, which was to say that there were hearings and continuances and motions and counter-motions, and Emily was deposed twice, once in Caldwell at the FBI field office, once in Washington at the U.S. Attorney's office, in a room with better furniture than the Caldwell office, but the same quality of fluorescent light. Both depositions went for longer than she expected and shorter than she feared. She was a good witness. She had known she would be because she'd spent years being precise about things, And precision under questioning was the same skill in a different context. The indictments against Braille, Stemfield, Voss, and Wade became public on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Kodiak had walked into the Harlow General Emergency Room. The press release ran in 3 national outlets and 1 military affairs publication. Emily read them at the nurse's station before her shift started, on her phone, with a coffee she'd made herself because the break room pot was empty and nobody had started a new one. She read the summary of charges. She read the quote from the U.S. Attorney's Office about the scope of the fraud. She read, in the military affairs piece, a single paragraph about a 2019 medical irregularity report filed by a major in the Army Medical Corps that had been closed and suppressed and that had now been formally re-entered into the record as the foundational evidence of the conspiracy timeline. Her name was not in the article. She had been told in advance that it wouldn't be. Kowalski had explained that pending sentencing, the witnesses and cooperating parties in active federal cases were not identified publicly. She'd understood the reasoning. She'd agreed with it. She sat at the nurse's station with her coffee and read her own absence from the story of what she'd done and tried to locate exactly how she felt about that. It took her a minute. What she felt was fine. Not resigned, not quietly bitter, not the particular sour piece of someone who has learned to accept less than they deserved. Just fine. The thing she had held on to for 6 years, the numbers that didn't add up, and the report that had been buried, and the names of dogs she'd never stopped thinking about. That thing had found its way into the world. It was in the federal record. It was in the case file. 11 dogs, 3 of them dead, and the people responsible were standing in front of judges in rooms with good furniture and bad fluorescent light. And the system that had buried her report in 2019 was the same system now using her report to prosecute the people who had buried it. The system was imperfect. It had always been imperfect. She had known that in 2019 and she knew it now. The difference was that imperfect systems, if you kept pushing, occasionally moved. She finished her coffee and started her shift. Kodiak came back to Harlow General on a Tuesday in December. Not as a patient. Emily was at the nurse's station doing a chart review when Renata appeared at her elbow and said, "There's someone in the lobby asking for you," with a tone of voice that meant it was something worth stopping for. She went to the lobby. Dale Morrow was standing near the entrance, winter coat, thinner than he'd been in November, looking like a man who had been taking better care of himself than he used to. Beside him, on a short leash, was Kodiak. The dog looked different than he had the last time he'd walked through those doors. He was standing evenly on all 4 legs. The compensation pattern was gone. The subtle weight shift from the left hindquarter that Emily had read within the first 4 seconds of seeing him that first morning. He was standing the way a dog stood when nothing hurt. Emily crossed the lobby. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him. His eyes found her face the same way they had the first time, with the same focused directness, and then he did what he had done before. He walked to her, 3 steps, and pressed his head against her knee. The lobby was not empty. There were people in chairs, a family near the entrance, 2 nurses at the intake desk who had stopped what they were doing, an orderly pushing a cart who slowed to a stop. Nobody said anything. Emily put her hand on the back of Kodiak's neck, in the place she'd touched that first morning, and felt the difference, the muscles loose now, no longer braced against the constant effort of compensating for pain. She crouched down and looked at him directly, and he looked back at her with the clear, uncomplicated gaze of an animal who understood exactly what he wanted to communicate and was communicating it. She was not someone who cried easily. She hadn't cried in the records room when she saw Stemfield's name. She hadn't cried in Washington when the deposition ended and the federal attorney shook her hand and said her documentation had been the difference between a case that held and a case that fell apart. She hadn't cried on the morning the indictments went public. She didn't cry now either. But she stayed crouched next to Kodiak for longer than she needed to, one hand on the back of his neck, and she breathed, and she let herself be in the moment without already moving to the next thing, which was something she had never been particularly good at and was trying, incrementally, to improve. "He wanted to come back," Dale said, from above her. She looked up at him. "I live 40 miles from here," he said. "He started for the door when I got in the truck. Just went to the door and looked at me. I figured I knew where he wanted to go." Emily stood up. "How's the leg?" "Mine or his?" "Both." "His is good," Dale said. "Lincoln team says it's better than expected. said whoever documented the secondary injury early gave them a cleaner picture to work with going in. He paused. Mine's fine. I follow the list. Good. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. There was something comfortable about it. Not the comfort of long familiarity, which they didn't have, but the comfort of a shared experience that had been genuinely difficult, and that neither of them had handled perfectly, but that had ended with both of them standing in a lobby on a Tuesday in December, which was more than either of them might have expected 3 days into November. I heard the indictments, he said. Saw the piece in the military affairs publication. Yes. Your name wasn't in it. No. He was quiet for a moment. Does that bother you? Emily thought about it honestly, which took about as long as thinking about it in the lobby 4 weeks ago had taken. Less than I would have expected, she said. Stemfield's going to plead, Dale said. My lawyer told me. And Braille, both of them. He looked at her steadily. The VA settled the K-9 coverage claim, not just Kodiak. They're reviewing 47 cases from handlers and units that received Halloran hardware. Emily absorbed this. 47 cases. She hadn't known the number had grown that large. Kowalski had mentioned ongoing reviews but hadn't given her specifics, which was standard for active proceedings. 47 handlers. 47 dogs. She thought about the tent in August. She thought about the numbers that had been wrong, and the report that nobody had wanted to read, and the meeting with Wade, where he'd looked at her with the calm of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. She thought about the January ritual, the server fee, the manila envelope, and the false bottom. She had kept those things because throwing them away would have felt like agreeing with the people who told her she was wrong. And it turned out that not agreeing, quietly, stubbornly, at a cost that had been real and ongoing, had mattered. Not in the way she'd imagined in 2019, not with the vindication arriving quickly and cleanly, the way vindication arrived in stories where the timeline was compressed. It had taken 6 years and a Belgian Malinois walking into an emergency room and a retired ranger with a pulmonary embolism and a 3-day chain of events that had been, at various points, frightening and exhausting and infuriating and occasionally absurd. But it had mattered. The Clinical Leadership Review Committee met on the second Thursday of December. Emily had submitted her application 4 weeks earlier. She sat in a conference room she'd been in many times. Not the federal one, the hospital's own, the one with the whiteboard that always had someone's half-erased notes from the previous meeting, and answered questions from a panel of 5 people for 50 minutes. Holt was on the panel. He said almost nothing, which she took to mean he'd already said what he had to say in the written assessment. The questions were about clinical judgment, crisis management, institutional communication, the gap between what nurses were empowered to do and what they were capable of doing. She answered each one without performing anything, without the careful self-effacement she'd spent 3 years using to manage the particular institutional dynamics of a hospital where her judgment was viewed as auxiliary rather than primary. She answered the way she answered things now, which was directly. At one point, the committee chair, a physician named Dr. Adeze Olusegun, who ran the hospital's quality improvement division and who Emily had interacted with maybe 4 times in 3 years, looked up from her notes and said, "You've been at Harlow General for 3 years. Is there a reason you haven't pursued leadership before this?" Emily looked at her. "I applied twice before. The assessment said insufficient supervisory experience." "You've had extensive supervisory experience in a previous career." "Yes." "Why didn't that carry weight in the earlier applications?" Emily chose her words carefully, not because she was protecting anyone, but because the question deserved precision. "I think the earlier applications were evaluated on the information in the file," she said, "and I'd made a choice when I came here not to put everything in the file." "Why?" Emily thought about this for a moment, about Caldwell and the long winter and the decision to be ordinary for a while, about what it had cost and what it had, in its own way, given her. 3 years of being a nurse without anyone expecting her to be anything else. 3 years of doing the work without the weight of a reputation or a record, which had been both limiting and sometimes clarifying. "Because I needed to find out if I was still good at this when nobody was watching," she said. The committee chair looked at her for a moment. "And?" she said. "I am," Emily said. She was offered the clinical leadership pathway on a Friday, in a letter that arrived in her hospital mailbox between a departmental memo about parking allocation and a pharmaceutical company mailer she threw away without opening. She read it twice and put it in her jacket pocket and went back to work. Renata found out before noon because Renata had sources in the administrative wing that Emily had never fully mapped and appeared at Emily's shoulder during a medication pass to say, "I heard." "News travels," Emily said. "Are you going to take it?" Emily looked at the patient chart in her hand. Room 214, 62-year-old male, recovering from a reaction to a new blood pressure medication, doing better than yesterday. "Yes," she said. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good," and went back to her station, which was the right response. Not a celebration, not a production, just a fact confirmed and a direction set. The sentencing hearings ran through February and into March. Emily attended 2 of them, not because she was required to, but because she wanted to be present. She sat in the gallery. She wore civilian clothes. She watched Curtis Braille receive 41 months in federal prison and a judgment requiring the dissolution of Halloran Defense Solutions Government Contracting Division. She watched Harlan Voss receive 27 months on the conspiracy and obstruction charges, his attorney's argument about the planted document having survived exactly as long as it took Summers' cooperation testimony to dismantle it. She watched Roy Stemfield. He received his sentence, 18 months, reduced for cooperation, standing with the posture she recognized from his voice on the phone, the posture of a career officer who had spent decades in rooms where he was the most important person, wearing civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes fit when you'd bought them to look like you weren't in uniform. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked at the judge with the composed expression of a man who had already processed what was happening and was now performing composure rather than experiencing it. Emily looked at him and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was very little. Not satisfaction, not the relief of a wrong finally set right. The relief had come earlier, incrementally, in smaller moments. The day Kodiak stood evenly on all 4 legs. The day Kowalski handed back the flash drive. The day Dale Morrow drove out of the Harlow General parking lot following the handwritten list. The feeling in the courtroom was quieter than any of those, less charged, more final. 18 months for the men who were dead, 6 for the dogs who were euthanized before anyone found the numbers wrong. She didn't stay for the full proceeding. She had a shift in the afternoon. Wade's hearing was the one she found hardest. Not because he received a lighter sentence. He didn't. He received 24 months, which was appropriate. But because of what he said when the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. He said he had made decisions he believed at the time were operationally necessary. He said the animals were assets, not soldiers. He said the complexity of the situation wasn't visible from where Emily had been standing. Emily sat in the gallery and listened to Terrence Wade explain his complexity and thought about a dog named Ruckus sleeping next to her cot, and the numbers that didn't add up, and the particular quality of Wade's voice when he'd called her a good medic and told her not to make this a problem for her career. She thought about the look on his face in that meeting so many years ago. Not angry, not guilty, just calm. The calm of a man who had already arranged the world to make his decision defensible, who had never once had to account for the difference between operationally necessary and personally profitable. He had been wrong, and the wrongness was simple, and the complexity he was describing was not complexity at all, but the architecture of self-justification, which was one of the most human things there was and one of the least forgivable. She left before he finished talking. Spring came to Caldwell in the grudging way it came to Nebraska. Not a sudden warmth, but a slow relenting, the cold loosening its grip in increments, the sky going from the flat white of winter to something with depth and color. Emily noticed it because she'd started walking to work on the mornings when the weather permitted, a habit she'd picked up after December and maintained, something about the half-mile between her apartment and the hospital that she'd come to need. She was 3 months into the clinical leadership pathway. It was harder than she'd expected, not because the clinical components were difficult, but because leadership in an institution was a different kind of work than leadership in a field, more lateral, more negotiated, requiring a tolerance for the pace of institutional change that she was building by necessity rather than temperament. She was not always patient. She did not always handle the friction of committee processes with the equanimity she wished she had. There was a meeting in February where she said something to a senior attending physician that was accurate and direct and landed badly and required a follow-up conversation the next day that she found genuinely uncomfortable and that she had, afterward, been glad she'd had. She was not a perfect leader. She was a good one. Holt was part of her pathway committee. He gave feedback that was honest and occasionally critical, and occasionally complimentary and always specific, which was the version of Holt she'd been seeing more of since November. The version that had recalibrated and was operating from the recalibration rather than the original setting. They were not close. They worked well together, which was a different thing, and in a hospital was often the more important one. She heard from Kowalski once more, in April, a brief email with a federal case update, and a sentence at the end that said, "The review board completed its assessment of your 2019 discharge. The findings have been revised. Formal notification will arrive separately." It arrived 10 days later, in a government envelope with a return address from the Army Review Board's agency. And the language inside was dense and procedural, the particular syntax of military bureaucracy performing the correction of itself. But the meaning was clear. The separation characterization had been changed. The conduct record had been revised. The insubordination finding had been withdrawn. She read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with the window open and the Nebraska spring doing its gradual work outside. And she felt something shift, not dramatically, not the way things shifted in the moments that were easiest to identify and describe, but in the small, permanent way that things shifted when a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing it was quietly removed. She sat with it for a while. Then she put the letter in the drawer where she kept things that mattered and didn't need to be displayed. And she made breakfast, and she sat at her kitchen table and ate it, and the morning was ordinary and full of light. The last time she saw Kodiak, it was a Tuesday in May. She was finishing a morning shift when she got a text from Dale, passing through Caldwell. Kodiak's asking for someone. She smiled at her phone, which was something she did more easily now than she used to, and she finished her charting and walked out through the main entrance and found them in the small courtyard off the hospital's main wing, Dale sitting on one of the concrete benches with a coffee he'd brought from somewhere. Kodiak lying in a patch of sunlight with the complete physical satisfaction of an animal who had been in pain for years and no longer was. The dog heard her footsteps before she came around the corner. By the time she was visible, he was already standing. He didn't run to her. He walked evenly, no compensation, no favor shown to any leg, 4-footed and unhurried and present, and he pressed his head against her hand because she'd dropped it to meet him, the same gesture he'd made in November, in the emergency room, in the chaos, in the moment before anyone in that building had understood what they were looking at. She held her hand against his head and felt his weight settle into her palm, and thought about what it meant that this dog had walked into a room full of people and found the one person who knew exactly what to look for. Maybe he'd smelled something she'd been carrying from years of working around animals. Maybe it was the way she moved, the absence of hesitation. Maybe it was the specific quality of a person who has spent years paying attention when nobody is watching, which produces a kind of stillness that animals understood better than people did. She didn't need to know which. Some things arrived without explanation and were true anyway. "He's good," she said. "He's good," Dale agreed. He was looking at his dog with the expression she'd seen on his face in room 224 in November, the complicated look, but uncomplicated now. The complexity had resolved into something simpler and cleaner, the look of a man who had come close to losing something and had not lost it after all. They sat in the courtyard for a while. Dale drank his coffee. Kodiak moved between them and the patch of sunlight and back, in the easy, purposeless way of a dog who had no agenda. Emily leaned back on the bench and turned her face toward the May sun and thought about nothing in particular, which was something she was still learning to do and had not yet mastered but was, she thought, getting better at. "What happens next for you?" Dale asked eventually. Emily thought about the clinical leadership pathway, about the committee meeting next week, the proposal she was drafting for a veteran patient intake protocol that would include canine wellness documentation as a standard component of handler assessments. A small thing, specific, the kind of change that wouldn't make news anywhere, but that would mean something to the next Dale Morrow, who walked into an ER with a dog who was hurting, and a handler who was hurting, and a set of records that didn't tell the true story. About the application she'd submitted on a quiet Thursday to join the Army Reserve's Medical Advisory Board as a civilian consultant. Not going back, not reversing the decision she'd made in that long winter, but making something of what she carried rather than just carrying it. "Work," she said. Dale nodded like that was the right answer. She stood up after a while and held out her hand, and Kodiak pressed his nose briefly against her palm. Not the head against the knee of the first time, something lighter, a passing acknowledgement, the gesture of an animal who knew the connection was established and didn't need to make a ceremony of it. She walked back through the courtyard door. Inside, the hospital was doing what hospitals did. The monitors and the voices and the particular rhythm of a place where people arrived broken, and some of them left better. She stopped for a moment in the corridor, the afternoon shift coming on, the morning shift wrapping up around her. She thought about the years she'd spent making herself small in this building. The careful self-effacement, the deliberate ordinariness, the choice to set her history aside and be nothing more than what her badge said. Emily Reeves, clinical nurse to 2. She didn't regret it entirely. She'd needed those years for reasons she was still understanding, and the work she'd done in them had been real work and good work, done for its own sake, the way the best things were. But she didn't need to be small anymore. She wasn't sure she'd ever needed to be. She thought what she'd needed was to find out whether who she was had survived what had happened to her, and she'd found out. And the answer was yes, imperfectly and incompletely, and with several years of evidence she could now examine honestly, yes. There were people in this building who needed someone to look at them the way she looked at Dale Morrow on a November morning. Not past them, not through them, but directly at them, with the full attention of someone who had learned to see what others missed, because she'd spent 20 years in rooms where missing things had consequences. She straightened her badge. She went back to work. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone would necessarily notice, because this was who she was, and she'd stopped apologizing for it, and she was done waiting for anyone else's permission to take up the space she'd earned.